Clara Whitmore slammed both hands flat on the wooden gate of Blackstone Ranch and looked the foreman dead in the eye. Behind her, 3 weeks of walking across open Montana prairie. Blistered feet, an empty stomach, a cloth bag holding everything she owned in this world. The man looked her up and down her heavy frame, her patched dress, her worn-out boots, and he laughed. Not quietly, loud enough for every cowboy in the yard to hear. "Cook for us," he said. "Darlin', you look like you need somebody to cook for you." If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that gate and find out what Clara did next. She did not flinch. That was the first thing anyone should have noticed about Clara Whitmore. That when Marcus Hale laughed in her face, she did not step back, did not drop her eyes, did not let a single muscle in her jaw tremble. She stood at that gate like she had been planted there by God himself and was in no particular hurry to be uprooted. The laughter spread through the yard the way fire spreads through dry grass. One cowboy nudged another. Someone near the water trough made a comment too low to hear clearly, but loud enough to draw a fresh wave of snickering from the men around him. A younger ranch hand leaned against the fence post with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face that he didn't bother hiding. Clara heard all of it. She had been hearing versions of that same laughter her entire life. She was 34 years old, a woman with a broad, heavy frame that people had been judging since she was old enough to understand what judgment meant. She was not tall. She was not what the magazines sold to women back east called fashionable or refined. Her brown cotton dress had been mended at the hem twice and the collar once. Her boots had seen too many miles and not enough cobblers. The cloth bag hanging from her right hand held 2 changes of clothes, a small iron skillet her mother had given her, and a folded piece of paper with a recipe written in handwriting so small you had to hold it close to read it. That was everything Clara Whitmore owned, and she had walked 3 weeks across open Montana prairie to get to this gate. Marcus Hale was the foreman of Blackstone Ranch, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a jaw like a fence rail and eyes the color of old stone. He had spent 20 years working cattle ranches across the territory, had seen men break down and give up in the middle of a summer drive, and had developed a habit of sizing people up in the first 10 seconds he laid eyes on them. He had decided what Clara Whitmore was before she opened her mouth. "We put out a notice for a ranch cook," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. "That was 2 weeks ago. Position may already be filled." "Is it?" Clara asked. A pause. "Not officially." "Then it's still open." Marcus shifted his weight. "Ma'am, I don't mean any disrespect, but this kitchen feeds 50-some-odd men 3 times a day. Hard men doing hard work. They don't have patience for—" He stopped himself, but his eyes completed the sentence for him as they traveled down her frame and back up again. "For what?" Clara said. Her voice was level, not cold, not sharp level, like a woman who had been asked this question before and had learned to let it hang in the air until the person asking it felt the full weight of what they'd said. Marcus cleared his throat. "For someone who can't handle the pace." "You don't know my pace." "I can make a reasonable estimate." "No," Clara said. "You can make a guess. There's a difference." One of the cowboys near the fence post, a lean young man with sun-bleached hair named Ethan Cole, let out a low breath that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. It was hard to tell. He was watching Clara the way you watch something unexpected with the particular stillness of a person who isn't sure yet what they're looking at. Marcus Hale set his jaw. "What's your name?" "Clara Whitmore." "Where are you from, Miss Whitmore?" "Originally Kansas, but I've cooked from Kansas to the Colorado line. Trail kitchens, roadside stops, boarding houses. I cooked for a cattle outfit out of Billings for 2 seasons before the owner sold off the herd." She paused. "I know what hungry men need, and I know how to give it to them from whatever happens to be in the pantry." "Our pantry," Marcus said flatly, "is nearly bare." "Then I'll need an inventory," Clara replied. "And I'll need your biggest pot, Something shifted in the yard. The laughter had quieted, not completely, but enough. There were still men watching with crossed arms and skeptical faces, but the easy mockery had softened into something closer to curiosity. People who are absolutely certain of something don't usually watch that carefully. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "The owner decides who we hire, not me." "Then take me to the owner." Another pause, longer this time. Marcus Hale looked at this heavy-set woman in her mended dress with her single cloth bag and her iron skillet, and her absolute refusal to be embarrassed, and something in the back of his chest that he couldn't quite name made him step back from the gate and gesture toward the main house. "This way," he said. Clara Whitmore picked up her bag and walked through the gate of Blackstone Ranch, as though she had already decided she belonged there. Nathaniel Blackstone was standing on the porch when they came around the side of the house, and Clara's first impression of him was that he looked like a man who hadn't slept soundly in months. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that carried a permanent tension in them, the kind that comes not from a single hard day, but from a long string of them. His dark hair had silver at the temples. His hands, even at rest, looked like they were ready to work. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, handsome in the rough-weathered way of men who had spent their lives outdoors, and his eyes were the deep, steady brown of creek water in late summer. He was a widower. Clara didn't know that yet, but she would learn it soon enough. She would learn it in the way the ranch hands spoke about him, in the careful quiet that fell over certain rooms in the house, in the empty chair at the head of the table that nobody ever sat in except Nathaniel himself. He looked at Clara the same way Marcus had, the quick visual assessment, the faint flicker of surprise. But there was something different in his expression. He didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He simply looked at her with the careful attention of a man who had learned somewhere along the road of his life that the obvious conclusion was often the wrong one. "Mr. Blackstone," Marcus said, "this woman's asking about the cook position." Nathaniel's gaze moved from Marcus to Clara and settled there. "That right?" "Yes, sir," Clara said. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I understand you're in need of someone who can feed your men and keep this kitchen running. I can do that." Nathaniel leaned against the porch railing. "You have experience cooking for large numbers." "I have. Trail kitchens, cattle outfits, boarding houses. I know how to stretch supplies, and I know how to make something worth eating out of what other people would call nothing." "Our supplies," Nathaniel said with a faint wry edge that might have been humor or might have been exhaustion, "are currently in what I'd describe as a charitable state of near emptiness. Mr. Hale told me. And that doesn't concern you." "It tells me what I'm working with," Clara said. "That's all I need." Nathaniel studied her. Behind him, through the open door of the ranch house, Clara could smell the lingering ghost of a kitchen that had once been well-used old smoke, dried herbs, the faint sweetness of cured wood. Someone had cooked good things in that house once. That someone was gone now. "What happened to your last cook?" Clara asked. A brief silence fell over the porch. Marcus shifted his weight. Nathaniel's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled deeper. "He took sick," Nathaniel said. "Last spring. Couldn't continue." "I'm sorry to hear that." "We've had 3 people through here since then," Nathaniel said. "None of them lasted more than 2 weeks." "What was wrong with them?" Marcus answered before Nathaniel could. "One couldn't manage the quantities. One got into a disagreement with 2 of the hands and quit before breakfast one morning. Third one..." He stopped. "Third one just wasn't good enough." Clara nodded slowly. "And your men are suffering for it." "My men," Nathaniel said carefully, "are reaching the end of their patience. We're in the middle of cattle season. These men work from before sunup to after dark. What they eat is the one thing I can give them that matters to their morale. And for 3 months now, what they've been getting is..." "Not enough," Clara said. Nathaniel paused. Then he said, "Not enough." Clara set her cloth bag down on the bottom porch step, straightened, and looked Nathaniel Blackstone directly in the eye with the steady, unhurried calm of a woman who had nothing left to lose and knew it. "Give me tonight," she said. "1 meal. Let me cook for your men tonight, and let them decide. If they don't want me here by morning, I'll be gone before the sun comes up. You won't owe me a thing." Behind her from somewhere in the yard came a voice, one of the cowboys who had been listening from too close to pretend he hadn't been. His name was Roy Cutter, and he was the kind of man who mistook cruelty for wit, and had spent too many years having other people laugh at his jokes. "One meal," Roy called out. "Lady, with all due respect, you look like you've had about 1,000 meals yourself. You sure you got enough left in you to make one for the rest of us?" The laughter that followed was loud and genuine and entirely unkind. Clara did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Nathaniel. Nathaniel's gaze had moved briefly, just briefly, to Roy Cutter, and what Clara saw in those brown eyes in that moment was not amusement. It was a quiet, contained something that looked considerably more like anger. He didn't raise his voice. He said simply and clearly, "Roy." The laughter stopped. One word. That was all it took. And Clara filed that away the way Nathaniel Blackstone could silence a yard full of cowboys with a single syllable and the right tone of voice. He looked back at her. "One meal," he said. "You've got the kitchen." The kitchen was at the back of the main house, connected by a covered walkway. And when Clara stepped inside it for the first time, she took a slow breath and looked around without saying anything. It was a large space. It had once been well organized, she could tell from the placement of the hooks on the walls, the way the shelves were arranged, the iron stove that was built for serious, sustained cooking. Someone had designed this kitchen with intention. Someone who knew what they were doing. But 3 months of inadequate cooks and low morale had left it in a state of disarray that bordered on abandonment. Pots were stacked without order, the shelves were dusty, the floor needed scrubbing, and the pantry, Marcus had not exaggerated, was in a condition that would have made a lesser cook turn around and walk back out the door. Clara stood in the pantry for 5 full minutes, touching things, reading labels, opening jars and tins, turning sacks over in her hands to feel the weight of what was inside. She was not calculating whether she could make a meal. She was deciding what kind of meal she was going to make. There were sacks of flour, old but usable. Dried beans, 2 varieties. A half-barrel of potatoes that needed sorting. Some had gone soft and would have to be discarded, but more than half were still firm. A small collection of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. Rosemary, thyme, 1 bundle of something she had to smell 3 times before she identified it as sage. Salt and black pepper in generous supply. A tin of lard. 2 small onions. A half-dozen dried chilies hanging near the herbs. And in the cold pantry off the main room, wrapped in cloth, a cut of beef that was modest, but not nothing, and a smoked ham bone that still had enough on it to give a pot of beans a reason to live. Clara came back out of the pantry and looked at the stove. She rolled up her sleeves. She started working. Ethan Cole was 19 years old and had been working at Blackstone Ranch for 6 months, which made him the youngest and most recently hired hand on the property. He was not the kind of young man who ran with the crowd when the crowd was being unkind. He hadn't laughed when Roy made his comment about Clara's appearance. He'd looked at the ground instead, the way people do when they're uncomfortable, but don't yet have the courage to say so out loud. He found himself near the kitchen walkway about an hour after Clara went inside. He told himself he was checking on the water barrel near the back of the house. He was not, in fact, checking on the water barrel. He was listening to the sounds coming from the kitchen, the rhythm of a knife on a cutting board, the controlled hiss of something going into a hot pan, the low, steady creak of the stove working at full heat. They were not the sounds of someone struggling. They were the sounds of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He hesitated at the kitchen door. Then he knocked. "Come in," Clara said without pausing what she was doing. Ethan stepped into the kitchen and stopped. The change in the air from outside was immediate warmth, steam, the beginning of a smell that his stomach responded to before his brain caught up. Clara was at the stove, stirring a large pot with one hand and crimping the edge of a flat piece of dough with the other, and she was doing both simultaneously, with the kind of easy competence that only comes from years of practice. "I was just—" Ethan started. "You were curious," Clara said, not unkindly, matter of fact. "That's all right." Ethan stood there. He looked at her hands. her broad, capable hands moving over the stove, and he saw what he'd noticed from the yard. The small scars, the faint burn marks along the inside of her right forearm, the thickened skin at the base of her palm from years of holding hot handles. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. Clara glanced at him sideways. "Since I was 7 years old. My mother ran a kitchen on one of the old trail routes in Kansas. Fed everyone who came through: drovers, settlers, soldiers, preachers. Didn't matter who you were or where you were going. If you sat down at her table, you ate well." She paused, adjusting the heat under the pot. "I watched her for years before she let me touch anything. Then she let me touch everything." Ethan moved closer, not too close, respectful of her space, but close enough to look at what was in the pot. The smell coming off it was already something remarkable. He couldn't have described it exactly: rich and dark and slow, like something that had been cooking much longer than it had. "What did you put in there?" he asked. "Beans, the ham bone, onion, the dried chilies from the ceiling because somebody had the good sense to hang them where they'd dry properly, some of the herbs, salt, thyme." She glanced at him again. "Thyme is the most important ingredient in a pot of beans. Most people don't give it enough." "The men out there," Ethan said carefully, "they're not—" "I know what the men out there think," Clara said. "I heard them." A short silence. "I'm sorry about what Roy said," Ethan offered. "That wasn't—" "You don't need to apologize for what someone else said." "I didn't say anything to stop it either." Clara looked at him, then really looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and something in her expression shifted. Not into anger. Into something gentler, and sadder, and more considered. "No," she said. "You didn't. But you're apologizing now, and that's worth something." She turned back to the stove. "Go on back to your work. Supper will be ready before dark." Ethan Cole walked back out of that kitchen feeling like he'd just been given something he couldn't name. He didn't say anything to the other men about what he'd seen. He went back to his work. But every time the wind shifted and carried the smell from the kitchen across the yard, he felt it again, that unnamed thing. The beans had been soaking since the moment Clara found them. Now they were in the largest pot the kitchen had, with the ham bone settled at the bottom and the broth building around it into something dark and fragrant and exactly right. Beside the stove, the potatoes she'd sorted were cut, and waiting a few of the dried herbs crumbled into the bowl with them, along with a careful measure of lard and salt. The beef was the problem. There wasn't enough of it to serve 50 men as a main portion, and Clara knew it. A lesser cook would have either apologized in advance or tried to stretch it in a way that would fool nobody. Clara did neither. She cut the beef into pieces smaller than a serving, but larger than an accent, browned them in the iron skillet with the 2 small onions, until the pan looked and smelled like something from a dream. Then added them to the bean pot, where they would spend the next 2 hours becoming something entirely different from what they'd started as. She made bread from the old flour. Not fancy bread, not bread that required time, she didn't have, but flat rounds of it cooked on the griddle in the lard until they were golden and slightly crisp on the outside and soft enough inside to tear and soak up whatever was on the plate beside them. She tasted everything, repeatedly adjusting with the confidence of someone who trusted her own palate absolutely. She worked without stopping for 4 hours. She did not ask for help. She did not allow herself to doubt. Outside, the sounds of the ranch continued: cattle moving, men calling to each other, the hammer from the direction of the repair barn. Inside the kitchen, Clara Whitmore built something out of near nothing, the way her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before, that the way women on the frontier had always built things out of whatever was available, out of necessity, out of the knowledge that hungry people deserved better than they usually got. Marcus Hale came to the kitchen doorway at 5 o'clock. He stood there for a moment without speaking, which was itself something. Marcus Hale was not a man who ran short of words. The smell coming from inside had reached a point where it was difficult to stand near the kitchen and feel nothing. Even Marcus, who had spent 3 months eating disappointing meals and telling himself it didn't matter, felt his stomach respond against his better judgment. "How much longer?" he asked. 30 minutes, Clara said. "Tell the men to wash up." Marcus opened his mouth, closed it again. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He was 2 steps back down the walkway before he stopped and turned around as though he'd surprised himself with something. Clara was not looking at him. She was pulling the bread rounds off the griddle, stacking them carefully, moving with the same unbroken efficiency she'd maintained for 4 hours. Marcus watched her for a moment. Then he went to tell the men to wash up. Roy Cutter washed his hands at the trough with the rest of the men and said 3 separate things about the new cook in the time it took him to dry them on his pants. None of those things particularly kind, but with slightly less conviction than his earlier comment. He'd been smelling that kitchen for the last hour and a half. He wasn't going to say so, but he'd been smelling it. The men filed toward the long table under the open sky beside the bunkhouse. The summer table, as they called it, where meals were served on warm evenings, so the dining room didn't become an oven. Clara carried the pots out herself, declining the offer of help from Ethan with a small shake of her head that was not unfriendly but was firm. She set the bean pot in the center of the table, the bread in baskets at each end, the potatoes in the iron serving dish she'd found at the back of a cabinet cleaned and seasoned, and cooked until they were soft enough to fall apart and crisp enough on the outside to hold their shape. Then she stepped back. She did not make a speech. She did not say anything at all. The men served themselves. Roy Cutter. Because he was Roy Cutter and could not help himself. Went first not out of eagerness, but out of the desire to be the one who delivered the verdict. He ladled beans into his bowl, took a piece of bread, added potatoes, and sat down with the air of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is only eating to confirm it. He took a bite. The yard was not silent. There were still men moving, serving themselves, finding seats. But in the particular radius around Roy Cutter, a pocket of quiet had formed. The men near him were watching, not obviously, not rudely, but watching in the way of people waiting for the first signal. Roy chewed. He looked down at his bowl. He took another bite, and then something happened to Roy Cutter's face that he was entirely unequipped to hide. A slow, involuntary softening, the kind that happens to people when something reaches past their defenses and touches something real. He didn't say anything. He reached for the bread and tore off another piece and used it to sweep the bottom of his bowl clean before he'd gotten halfway through the beans. The man beside him said, "Well," Roy said, "shut up and eat," which was in the language of Roy Cutter approximately a 5-star review. Within 10 minutes, the table had gone quiet in the way that tables go quiet when people are genuinely eating, not politely eating, not forcing food down out of necessity, genuinely eating with attention and focus, and the particular pleasure of a body that is finally getting what it needed. One man, a broad Swede named Gunnar, who had said perhaps 20 words in the 2 months he'd been at Blackstone Ranch, looked up from his bowl with an expression of mild bewilderment, as though he'd expected something unremarkable and received something that confused him with its excellence. "This is good," he said to no one in particular. Several men nodded without looking up. An older cowboy named Bill Reese set down his spoon long enough to tear off a piece of bread, and when the bread hit the broth in his bowl and he brought it to his mouth, he made a sound, soft, involuntary, barely audible, that only happened to men who were reminded suddenly and without warning of something they hadn't thought about in years. "My mother made beans like this," he said quietly, almost to himself, "back in Tennessee when I was a boy." Nobody laughed at that. The man on his right just nodded and kept eating. Bye. Nathaniel Blackstone ate at the end of the table, as he always did, sat slightly apart from the men in the way of a man who lived among people but did not fully live with them, the particular solitude of someone who carries responsibility for others and has learned that a certain distance is part of that. He had not spoken since he'd taken his seat. He ate slowly and deliberately, which was how Nathaniel Blackstone did most things, not because he was a slow man, but because he was a careful one. He tasted the beans. He tasted the bread. He looked down at his bowl for a moment in a way that might, to someone watching carefully, have looked like a man composing himself. He did not compose himself outwardly. He was too practiced at stillness for that. But something happened in his eyes that a careful person might have noticed, a softening, a reaching back. The smell of this food had taken him somewhere. Not a place exactly. A time. A kitchen in winter, when his wife was still alive, when this ranch had been warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stoves. He looked toward the kitchen. Clara was not at the table. She had not served herself with the men. She had taken a small bowl and a piece of bread and sat down on the step at the edge of the covered walkway, a little apart from everything. The way she'd apparently arranged her whole life at the edge, giving what she had, taking only what was left. Nathaniel watched her for a moment. He looked back down at his bowl. He finished his meal in silence. But something had shifted in him quietly, the way things shift in people when they encounter something they weren't prepared for. He didn't name it yet. He was not the kind of man who named things quickly. But it was there. The second plate requests started before the first round of eating was finished. Ethan was the first to stand because Ethan had been honest with himself since he left the kitchen earlier and saw no reason to stop now. He brought his bowl back to the pot, ladled more beans, took another piece of bread, and sat back down with the air of someone who has decided that whatever anyone else thinks about his appetite, he doesn't particularly care. Then Roy Cutter stood up. There was a beat, a fraction of a second, where the men near him glanced over, and Roy, feeling the glance, said, "Don't look at me," and went to refill his bowl anyway. After that, it was general. Men who had planned to eat once and be done with it got up and came back. The bread baskets emptied. The potato dish was scraped clean. The bean pot, the enormous bean pot that Clara had filled to the rim, was down to its last third before the sun finished setting. One man, a quiet, weathered cowboy named Samuel, who had been at Blackstone Ranch for 12 years, walked past Clara on his way to the pot with his empty bowl and paused. He stopped. He turned back. "Ma'am," he said, with the deliberate courtesy of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean, "that's the best meal I've had on this property in 2 years. Clara looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. Samuel nodded once the way men of few words nod when they've said everything they have to say, and went on to refill his bowl. Later, when the table was cleared and the men had drifted back to their evening routines, Marcus Hale found himself standing at the kitchen door again. Clara was washing the pots. He stood in the doorway for long enough that she knew he was there, and she continued washing without turning around. "You can say it," she said. "Say what?" "Whatever you came here to say." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The men want to know if you'll be here for breakfast." Clara stopped washing. She set the pot down on the counter and turned to look at him. "That's for Mr. Blackstone to say," she answered, "not the men." "Then I'll tell him the men want to know." "You do that." Marcus stood there. He was not a man who apologized easily, or often the architecture of his character had not been built with that particular door in an obvious place. But he was also not a dishonest man, and what had happened at that table tonight had made certain dishonest positions difficult to maintain. He said, "When you came through that gate this afternoon, I made up my mind about you before you said a word." Clara waited. "I was wrong to do that." She looked at him steadily. "You weren't wrong to have questions," she said. "Questions are honest. What they come with is what matters." Marcus absorbed that. "Yes, ma'am." "I've spent a lot of my life with people having questions about me," Clara said, turning back to the pot. "I've gotten fairly used to it. What I don't get used to is when the questions come with the kind of laughter that's meant to make a person feel small. That kind it wears on you." "I didn't laugh," Marcus said. "No," Clara agreed. "You didn't." Another silence. "Breakfast is at 5:30, Marcus said finally. "Men need to be in the field by 7. "I'll have it ready at 5:15, Clara said. Marcus Hale turned and walked back down the covered walkway, and he did not look back, but something in the set of his shoulders was different from how it had been that afternoon. Something had come off him. Not all of it, and not easily, but something. Turned. Nathaniel Blackstone came to the kitchen just before dark. Clara heard his boots on the walkway before she saw him, a heavier tread than Ethan's, more deliberate than Marcus's, and she didn't stop what she was doing which was scrubbing the bean pot for the second time to get the settled layer off the bottom. He stood in the kitchen doorway. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Blackstone." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, Clara could hear the ranch settling into its evening sounds. The cattle in the distance, someone closing the barn door, the faint rhythm of a harmonica from the direction of the bunkhouse. "Where will you sleep tonight?" he asked. Clara paused. She hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. "There's a spot near the storage room that looked dry. I'll manage." "There's a room off of the kitchen," Nathaniel said. It was the old cook's quarters. Nothing fancy, caught a washstand, a hook for your clothes. But it's dry and it has a proper door. Clara looked at him. "You're offering me the room," she said. "I'm offering you the job," Nathaniel Blackstone said. "The room comes with it." Clara set the pot down. She straightened and looked at Nathaniel, the way she'd looked at him across that porch, directly without performance, with the full and unguarded weight of a woman who had learned not to waste time on pretense. "You said 1 meal," she said. "1 meal was all I needed," he said. A pause. "Your terms," Nathaniel said. "Whatever you were paid last. Tell me and I'll match it, or explain why I can't." Clara told him. He didn't flinch. "Done," he said. "I'll have Marcus write it up in the morning." He turned to leave. "Mr. Blackstone," Clara said. He stopped. "Those men tonight," she said. "They needed more than food. You know that." Nathaniel stood with his back partly to her, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something he was deciding whether or not to speak. "I know it," he said finally. "I've known it for months." He paused. "I wasn't sure it was something I could fix." "It's not something you can fix," Clara said, not unkindly. "It's something that gets fixed 1 meal at a time, 1 person at a time. That's how it always works." Nathaniel was quiet. "Get some rest, Miss Whitmore," he said. "You've got 50 men to feed before sunrise." He walked back down the covered walkway. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her kitchen now, though she hadn't named it that yet, though she wouldn't name it that for a while, and looked around at the cleaned pots and the empty baskets and the pot hooks on the walls and the iron stove ticking quietly as it cooled. She had walked 3 weeks across open Montana prairie. She had stood at a gate and been laughed at. She had been told with every look and gesture and poorly hidden smirk that she was not what they needed, not what they wanted, not what anyone in this yard was willing to believe in. She had cooked for 50 men from the contents of a nearly empty pantry, and now she had a room with a proper door. Clara Whitmore picked up her cloth bag from the corner where she'd set it. When she came in, walked to the door of the small room off the kitchen and pushed it open. The cot was narrow. The washstand had a crack in the basin. The hook on the wall was slightly crooked. She hung her bag on it anyway. She sat down on the cot and looked at the closed kitchen door for a long moment, listening to the harmonica from the bunkhouse and the cattle in the distance and the last of the evening wind moving through the eaves. Then she lay down still in her dress and closed her eyes. She had more than she'd had that morning. She had a chance. And Clara Whitmore, who had never needed more than a chance, intended to use this one, all the way down to the bone. She was up before 4, not because she'd slept poorly. She'd slept the deep, boneless sleep of someone who had walked 3 weeks across open ground and then cooked for 4 hours without stopping. She was up before 4 because that was when her body woke her the way it always had the internal clock of a woman who had spent her life in kitchens, where the first fire had to be lit before anyone else in the building opened their eyes. She built the stove fire in the dark by feel and habit, the way her mother had taught her. You didn't need light to lay kindling. You needed your hands and your memory, and Clara Whitmore had plenty of both. By 4:30 the stove was hot and she was moving. She'd done a more thorough inventory of the pantry the night before, after Nathaniel left, holding the lamp close to the shelves, pulling things forward, reading labels, checking weights. The picture wasn't as bleak as it had first appeared. There were things buried at the back that the previous cooks hadn't bothered to find: a tin of molasses, 2 cans of tomatoes, a cloth bag of cornmeal that was old but still good, a jar of dried apple slices that smelled fine when she opened it and held it near the flame. She soaked the cornmeal while the stove climbed to temperature. She put a second pot of beans on different preparation from last night, something lighter, something that would pair with eggs if she could get them. She'd seen chickens in the yard the evening before. Where there were chickens, there were eggs. And where there were eggs in a ranch kitchen, there was no excuse for a bad breakfast. She was halfway through the second batch of biscuits when Ethan Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped when he saw her, clearly not expecting the kitchen to be fully operational at 4:45 in the morning. He was still buttoning his shirt. His hair wasn't combed. He looked like a young man who had planned to arrive early and discovered he wasn't early enough. "Ma'am," he said, slightly out of breath. "You're up early," Clara said. I thought you might need help with the fire." "Fire's been going for 45 minutes. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking at the fully functioning kitchen with the expression of someone who had come to deliver necessary assistance and found the battle already won. "Right," he said. Is there anything—" "Eggs?" Clara said. "There are chickens in the yard. How many do they usually give?" "Maybe 3 dozen on a good morning. Sometimes more. Go find me the good morning's worth, carefully." "Yes, ma'am." He turned, then stopped. "Miss Whitmore, the other men. They were talking last night, after supper. I don't know if you heard any of it." Clara continued working. "What were they saying?" Ethan seemed to search for the right way to frame it. "They were saying—" He paused. "Roy said you must have put something in it, like a trick, that no cook can do what you did with what we had in that pantry." Clara's hands didn't slow. "What did you say?" "I said I'd been in here while you were cooking and there wasn't any trick. I said you just—" He stopped again. "I said you just knew what you were doing. And Roy said that was the most boring explanation he'd ever heard." Ethan's mouth curved just slightly. "But he also had 3 bowls. So—" Clara glanced at him, a quick look, warm and dry at the same time. "Go get my eggs, Ethan." He went. She went back to the biscuits, pressing the dough with the heel of her hand in the rhythm her mother had taught her. The rhythm that was so deep in her muscle memory now that she could do it in her sleep. And she thought about Roy Cutter saying there must have been a trick. She'd heard variations of that her whole life. When you were a woman who looked like Clara, when you were heavy and plain dressed and arrived somewhere without papers or references, or a man standing behind you to vouch for your existence, people needed an explanation for your competence that didn't require them to revise their first impression. A trick, a stroke of luck, someone else's recipe, something that let them keep their original conclusion intact. Clara shaped the biscuits and set them in the pan. The trick was 27 years of not stopping. Breakfast hit the table at 5:15 on the nose. Biscuits, 2 dozen of them golden and stacked in the center of the table. Beans from the morning pot, thinner and brighter than last night's, ladled into the communal bowls. Scrambled eggs, 34 of them cooked in the iron skillet in 2 rounds, because the pan couldn't hold them all at once, seasoned with salt and black pepper, and the last half-inch of something she'd found in a small bottle at the back of the herb shelf that turned out to be dried chili flake. Coffee, real coffee, strong and black, from a tin she'd found behind the cornmeal, more than half full. The men came out of the bunkhouse in varying states of wakefulness and stopped when they got close enough to smell what was waiting. Roy Cutter stopped harder than anyone. He stood at the edge of the table with his hat in his hand. He'd been reaching up to tip it in greeting to no one in particular, as men do in the morning, and he stayed there, hat half lifted, staring at the biscuits with an expression he clearly had not planned on his face. "Every morning," he said to nobody specific. Bill Reese, already seated with his coffee, said, "Sit down, Roy." Roy sat down. He took a biscuit. He broke it open. The steam came off it in a thin curl, and the inside was soft and white and exactly right, and Roy Cutter looked at it for just a fraction of a second longer than he needed to before he put it in his mouth. He reached for another one before he'd finished the first. Clara watched from the edge of the covered walkway, where she was holding her own cup of coffee. She was not watching to be acknowledged. She was watching the way a craftsman watches work that's just been tested with the measuring attention of someone who needs to know what worked and what to adjust. What she saw was that the eggs were nearly gone in 4 minutes, that the biscuits were finished in 6, that 3 men came back for second helpings of beans and were met by an empty pot, and that their disappointment was visible and genuine. She made a note of it not on paper, but in the internal accounting that had governed her cooking life since childhood: make more eggs, make more biscuits. When you're feeding men who work like this, the math of sufficiency runs higher than you think. Marcus Hale came to find her at 7:30 when the breakfast things were cleared and she was already into her preparation for the midday meal. He stood in the kitchen doorway in the posture he seemed to default to around Clara, hands loose at his sides, hat in one hand, jaw set in the slightly stiffened way of a man who has decided to say something difficult and is committed to seeing it through. "Mr. Blackstone wants to see you," he said, "when you have a moment." "I have a moment now," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. She followed Marcus across the yard to the main house, and Marcus did not make conversation as they walked, which was fine with Clara. She used the 2 minutes to think about what Nathaniel might want to discuss. The job terms had been agreed upon last night, unless he'd changed his mind, and she didn't read him as a man who changed his mind. For small reasons, it was something else. Nathaniel was at his desk in the small room off the front parlor that served as his office. He stood when she came in, which she noticed some men did, some men didn't, and the ones who did were telling you something about how they'd been raised. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "sit down, please." She sat. He looked at her with the same careful, leveled attention he'd given her on the porch the previous afternoon. The look of a man who is genuinely trying to see what's in front of him rather than what he's expecting. "I heard breakfast was exceptional," he said. "It was adequate," Clara said. "There weren't enough biscuits. I'll correct that tomorrow." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one like the first hint of warmth in a sky that's been overcast. "The men don't seem to share your assessment of adequate. The men have been eating badly for 3 months. My bar and their bar are not the same bar." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "I wanted to talk to you about supplies." He opened a ledger on the desk and turned it partway toward her. "The ranch account. We've been spending inconsistently on provisions, sometimes too much on the wrong things, sometimes too little on the right ones. The previous cooks ordered what they wanted without consulting anyone, which meant the budget went to things that didn't matter, and we ran short on things that did." Clara leaned forward slightly and looked at the figures he was pointing to. Her eyes moved across the columns with the practiced ease of someone who was more comfortable with numbers than most people expected. "You're buying flour from the wrong supplier," she said. Nathaniel looked up. "Excuse me, this price." She pointed at a column entry. "For this quantity. You're paying above the going rate, and whoever's supplying you is taking advantage. I can get the same amount at a better price from a mill I know of about 40 miles northeast of here. They'll deliver with a minimum order, which this ranch exceeds easily." Nathaniel looked at the figure she was pointing at. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been buying supplies for large-scale kitchens for 15 years, Clara said. "I know what things should cost, and I know that the person who's been ordering for this kitchen has been either careless or—" She stopped. "Or what?" Nathaniel said quietly. Clara looked at him. "Or not entirely looking out for your interests." A silence fell over the room that was distinctly different from the comfortable kind. Nathaniel's expression didn't change on the surface, but something shifted underneath it. A tightening. A watchfulness. The look of a man who has just heard something confirm a suspicion he'd been trying to dismiss. "That's a serious thing to say," he said. "I know it is," Clara said. "And I could be wrong. I don't have enough information to be certain. But the numbers don't add up the way they should, and someone who was managing this kitchen carefully would have noticed that." Nathaniel closed the ledger. He was quiet for long enough that Clara wondered if she'd overstepped. She was new here. She had been here for less than 24 hours. This was not the kind of observation a new hire typically made on their first morning. But she had never been the kind of woman who saw something and said nothing. "I'll look into it," Nathaniel said finally. His voice was measured, not dismissive, not alarmed, but careful in the way of someone filing something away to be examined in private. "In the meantime, I'd like you to take over the supply ordering. All of it. I'll authorize your name at the supplier accounts in town." Clara nodded. "I'll need a horse or access to the wagon." "You'll have both. And I'll need to know your true budget, not what you've been spending, but what you can actually afford." Nathaniel told her the number. Clara thought about it for 3 seconds. "I can do considerably better than you've been doing for that amount." "I believe you," Nathaniel Blackstone said. And the thing was, he sounded like he meant it. She was back in the kitchen by 8, and by 8:15 she knew there was a problem, not with the food, with the kitchen itself. The stove had been running well since she'd woken up, but the morning's hard use had revealed something she hadn't noticed in the lamplight the night before: a crack in the secondary firebox wall. Not large enough to be immediately dangerous, but large enough to affect the heat distribution across the cooking surface. It explained why the far right side of the griddle had been running cooler than the left all morning, why she'd had to compensate by moving the pans, why the biscuits had browned unevenly across the 2 batches. She crouched down and looked at the crack. She sat back on her heels and thought about it. Then she went to find Marcus Hale. Marcus was in the equipment barn overseeing the morning departure of the cattle hands. He saw her coming, and his expression moved through 3 things: quickly, surprise, wariness, and the specific braced readiness of a man who has learned from experience that when women come toward him with that particular walk, they need something addressed immediately. "The kitchen stove has a cracked firebox wall," Clara said. "It needs a smith to look at it before it gets worse. If that crack spreads, we lose the stove. And if we lose the stove, I can't cook. And if I can't cook—" "You can't cook," Marcus said. "The men don't eat," Clara said. "And from what I understand, that's where this ranch's problem started." Marcus looked at her steadily. "I'll send someone to town today." "Today," Clara confirmed. "Today." Marcus agreed. She went back to the kitchen. She spent the next hour working around the uneven heat distribution with the particular creative stubbornness of someone who has cooked on worse equipment in harder circumstances and never let a broken tool become an excuse. The midday meal, a thick soup made from the tomatoes and the remaining beans and the cornmeal, formed into small rounds and fried until they were solid enough to eat. With your hands, came out exactly as intended. But when the men sat down to eat at noon, something was different from the morning. The easy warmth of a shared good breakfast had settled into something a little more complicated. Clara noticed it while she was moving through the table-filling bowls. A tightness in the air. A conversation that stopped when she passed. Roy Cutter, who had been almost subdued at breakfast, back to his usual volume, but the laughter was pointed in a direction she couldn't immediately identify. She set down the pot and listened. "All I'm saying is, it's one thing for a day, but Blackstone's talking about keeping her on permanent. Marcus said he authorized her at the supply accounts. She's going to be ordering for the whole ranch. Never heard of a cook ordering supplies. That's not a cook. That's something else." "What are you saying, Roy?" "I'm saying it's peculiar is all. Woman shows up out of nowhere overnight. She's got a room. She's got accounts. She's got the best food I've eaten since my wife died," said the broad voice of Gunnar the Swede, and there was a flatness to it that suggested the comment was not an invitation to continue the conversation. A brief silence. Roy Cutter said with slightly less confidence, "I'm just saying it doesn't add up." "What doesn't add up," said Bill Reese, without looking up from his bowl, "is how you can eat 3 helpings of a woman's cooking and then sit here and question whether she belongs. That doesn't add up, Roy." Another silence. A different quality to it this time. Clara picked up the pot and moved on. She was aware with the clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life being the person people talked about in the room adjacent to the room she was in, that Roy Cutter's concerns were not entirely about efficiency or propriety. They were about the specific discomfort of a man whose first impression has been proven wrong in front of an audience who needs a new story to explain how that happened without requiring him to admit he was simply mistaken. She had met many Roy Cutters in her life. She did not waste energy being angry at them. She put her energy somewhere else. After the midday meal, when the kitchen was cleaned and the afternoon's prep was underway, she went to find Ethan Cole. She found him at the corral fence, watching the horses with the particular attention of a young man who is fond of animals and not embarrassed about it. "I need someone to take me into town," she said. "Tomorrow or the day after. I need to visit the suppliers, start setting up the accounts Mr. Blackstone authorized. Is there someone who makes regular supply runs?" "Tom Briggs usually does," Ethan said, "but Tom's out with the main herd until Friday." "Who else?" Ethan thought. "I can take you. I know the road." Clara looked at him. "Don't you have cattle work?" "I'm on fence repair this week. Marcus can spare me for a day." "Ask Marcus," Clara said. "I don't want you getting in trouble on my account." Ethan pushed off the fence and stood up straight in the easy, unconscious way of young men who haven't yet learned to take up less space in the world. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've been on fence repair for 3 weeks. I will actively seek trouble if it gets me off fence repair for a day." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. It was a genuine laugh, short, surprised, warm, and it changed her face entirely. Ethan blinked as though he hadn't been quite sure until that moment that she was capable of it. "Ask Marcus," she said again, and went back to the kitchen. The afternoon passed in the rhythm of steady work, and Clara moved through it the way she always moved through it, methodically, without hurry, with the particular peace of a person doing the thing they were made to do. She was making 3 things simultaneously: a marinade for the beef she'd requested from the cold storage that morning, a batch of pastry dough resting under a damp cloth, and a rough supply list for her trip to town. At 4 o'clock she heard raised voices from somewhere toward the main house. Not the ordinary volume of men talking or working something sharper. She set down her rolling pin and went to the kitchen doorway, not out of curiosity, but because raised voices in a workplace sometimes meant she needed to move pots off the fire. She couldn't see the main house from the kitchen door, but she could hear Nathaniel's voice, or rather, she could hear the distinctive quality of his voice in a mode she hadn't encountered yet. Low-controlled, but carrying the particular steel of a man who is making himself very clear. She couldn't make out words. Then Marcus came around the side of the building at a fast walk, and when he passed the kitchen doorway, he glanced at her and slowed. "Nothing to worry about," he said. "I wasn't worried," Clara said. "Who is that?" Marcus stopped. He had the look of a man deciding how much to say. "The previous supply man, fellow named Duncan Webb. He came to discuss the change in the supply accounts." Clara was very still. "He came to discuss it in person." "Came in unannounced," Marcus said, "which is not typical." "No," Clara said slowly. "It isn't." Marcus looked at her. "You said this morning you thought the numbers didn't add up." "I said I could be wrong, and if you're not wrong—" Clara thought about it for a moment. "Then someone's been skimming from this ranch's food budget for long enough that the idea of losing the arrangement was worth making a personal trip over." Marcus absorbed that. The muscle in his jaw moved. "Blackstone's handling it." "I don't doubt that," Clara said. Marcus went on. She went back to the kitchen. 20 minutes later, she heard a horse leave the yard at a pace that suggested its rider was not pleased. "Chantong." Nathaniel came to the kitchen at 5 o'clock, and when Clara saw his face, she knew the conversation with Duncan Webb had not been a small one. He was not agitated. Nathaniel Blackstone's mode of dealing with difficulty appeared to involve going very still and very controlled, rather than expansive or loud, but there was something in the set of his eyes that was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He sat down on the wooden stool near the kitchen door that Clara had come to think of as the visitor stool, because it was where people perched when they came in and didn't quite commit to entering. He didn't say anything for a moment. Clara worked. She let the silence sit because she had learned over many years that people who came into kitchens and sat down and went quiet were usually working toward something, and the worst thing you could do was push them. Webb was skimming, Nathaniel said finally. Clara nodded. Not a small amount. He's been supplying this ranch for 4 years. Marcus thinks it's been going on for at least 2 of them. He was quiet. I trusted him. He sold to my wife's family before we married. I thought... He stopped. You thought the history meant something, Clara said. Apparently it meant less than I thought. She could hear the particular flatness in his voice that comes from a kind of betrayal that isn't just financial, the kind that reaches back and casts a shadow over things you thought were solid. She recognized it. She'd had her own versions of it. How much, she asked, because she was a practical woman and the question needed to be asked. He told her. She didn't react outwardly, but the number landed in her chest with weight. It was significant. Not enough to break the ranch on its own, but enough to matter, and enough that its absence over those 2 years would have changed what the ranch's kitchen could have been, what the men could have been eating, how much more comfortable the operation could have run. You caught it, she said. You caught it, Nathaniel said. One morning. You'd been here one morning. I've been managing kitchen budgets for a long time. I know what things cost. Everyone who worked here before you, Nathaniel said, saw the same ledger. Nobody said a word. Clara thought about that. She thought about the parade of cooks who had come through here, none of them lasting more than 2 weeks, and she wondered how many of them had simply not known, and how many had known and decided it was not their problem, and how many had been paid quietly to look the other way. She didn't say any of that. It wasn't her place to say it yet. He's gone, she said. He's gone, Nathaniel confirmed. He won't be back. She slid the pastry off the counter and into the oven with the practiced care of someone who has made 10,000 pastries and respects every one of them. There's a mill 40 miles northeast of here, she said. Better prices. Reliable delivery. I'll write to them tomorrow and ask for terms. She paused. With the money you won't be sending to Webb anymore, you'll be able to restock this pantry properly within the month. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. You're not just a cook, he said. It was not a question, but it also wasn't quite what it sounded like. It wasn't doubt, wasn't suspicion. It was the observation of a man who had hired someone to do one thing and discovered they were capable of considerably more. I'm exactly a cook, Clara said. I've just been doing it long enough to learn everything a cook needs to know to do it well. She glanced at him sideways. You'd be surprised how much management is involved in feeding 50 people 3 times a day without wasting anything. Something crossed Nathaniel's face that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite something else. It was in between, in the complicated middle territory of emotions that don't have simple names. Supper's at 7, Clara said. Beef with the marinade and the turnip pastry and the rest of the cornbread from this morning. It'll be good. I don't doubt it, Nathaniel said. He stood. He paused at the doorway. Miss Whitmore, he said. Thank you. She didn't stop working, but she nodded once, and it was the nod of a woman who has heard gratitude before, but is not quite used to receiving it from someone who means it the way he meant it. Supper that evening was different. Not in the food, though. The food was excellent, and the table proved it, in the way tables always prove these things through emptied dishes and men who stop talking long enough to focus on eating. But the mood was different, looser. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the ranch in the hours between the dust of Duncan Webb's departure and the setting of the sun, and Clara, carrying the serving dishes out to the table, felt it the moment she stepped into the yard. The men knew something had happened. Information in a bunkhouse travels the way smoke travels. You can't always see where it came from, but it gets everywhere. Gunnar the Swede stopped Clara as she turned to go back to the kitchen. Webb, he said simply. His big face was calm, but there was something in his eyes that was direct and deliberate. That's Mr. Blackstone's business, Clara said carefully. He was stealing from us, Gunnar said. Not a question. Clara met his gaze. What makes you say that? The food this year was worse than before. Same budget as before, Marcus told us. Something was wrong. He paused. Nobody wanted to say it, but we all knew. Clara was quiet for a moment. Things will be different now, she said. Gunnar looked at her with the long, steady evaluation of a man who doesn't distribute trust easily and knows the value of it. Then he nodded once. He went back to the table. Roy Cutter, for the first time since Clara had arrived, said nothing sharp. He ate his supper. He finished it. He sat with his elbow on the table, in the posture of a man who is doing private accounting in his head, adding things up and arriving at a conclusion he hasn't decided how to handle yet. Bill Reese beside him said quietly, "She found it in one morning, Roy." Roy said nothing. "One morning," Bill said again. Roy picked up the last piece of cornbread on the platter and did not respond. And in that deliberate silence was the beginning of something, not an apology, not yet, and maybe not ever in the conventional sense, but the first crack in a wall that had been built on a wrong foundation. Cool. Clara was finishing the last of the washing at 8:30 when she heard Nathaniel's boots on the walkway. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, and she recognized by now the particular pace that meant he was coming to talk rather than to check on something. "Word's gotten around," he said. "About Webb." "I figured it would. The men they're not happy about it, but they're—" He paused, looking for the right word. "Settled. Which is different from how they've been for months. They needed to know someone was paying attention," Clara said. "Not just to the food, to the whole thing." Nathaniel leaned against the door frame. In the lamplight, he looked different than he had in the full light of day. Not softer exactly, but more visible. The tiredness around his eyes, the way his hands, even at rest, told the story of years of physical work. "My wife used to say that," he said. "That people need to know someone's paying attention." It was the first time he'd mentioned her voluntarily. Clara kept her hands moving in the wash water and didn't make a thing of it. "She sounds like she was a smart woman," Clara said. "She was the smartest person I've known," Nathaniel said. And then, after a pause that held the particular weight of something both true and difficult until recently, Clara went still. Just for a moment. Then she went back to the washing. "Your stove will be fixed tomorrow," Nathaniel said, his voice returning to the level register of practical things. "I sent for the smith this afternoon. He'll be here by mid-morning." "Good," Clara said. "I've been working around the heat distribution, but it's adding time." "Also," Nathaniel said, "I've authorized a full supply order. Whatever the kitchen needs, not what we can barely manage, what we actually need. I want you to write up the order tonight if you can." Clara looked over her shoulder at him. "I already started it this afternoon," she said. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, that careful measuring look that she was beginning to recognize as his version of being impressed, which was not a showy version, not a declarative version, but the quiet internal kind that showed up in the steadiness of his attention. "Of course you did," he said. He said goodnight. She listened to his boots on the walkway, and when they faded, she stood alone in the kitchen in the good, purposeful quiet of a woman who has had a hard day and done something worth doing at the end of it. She had been here 2 days. She had fed 50 men twice. She had uncovered a theft that had been draining this ranch for 2 years. She had been laughed at, questioned, talked about, and quietly, slowly, imperfectly begun to be seen. She was not finished. She went to the small room off the kitchen, sat on the narrow cot with the supply order on her knee, and wrote in her small, precise handwriting by the light of the lamp until the list was complete and the ranch of Blackstone, Montana, had what it needed to feed its people the way its people deserved to be fed. Outside, the harmonica from the bunkhouse was playing something slow and not unhappy. Clara finished the last line of the list. She folded it. She set it on the washstand, where she would not forget it in the morning. Then she lay back on the cot in the good dark and listened to the sound of a ranch that was slowly becoming something different from what it had been, and felt for the first time in a long time that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The supply order went out on Thursday morning, carried into town by Ethan Cole, on a horse that had clearly been waiting for something more interesting than standing in a corral. Clara handed him the folded list at 4:45, before the breakfast fire was fully up to heat, and Ethan tucked it inside his vest with the careful solemnity of a young man who has been trusted with something that matters. "Don't lose it," Clara said. "I won't. And don't let the merchant at Halverson's talk you into substitutions. The list says what it says for a reason." "Yes, ma'am." "And Ethan," he looked back from the doorway, "eat something before you go. There are biscuits from yesterday in the cloth on the second shelf. A man shouldn't ride 40 miles on an empty stomach." Ethan Cole smiled the wide, uncomplicated smile of someone who is young enough to still be caught off guard by kindness, and took 2 biscuits and went. Clara went back to the stove. The smith had come the previous morning, as Nathaniel promised, and the firebox crack had been repaired with the methodical competence of a man who had been fixing ranch stoves across the Montana Territory for 30 years. The stove ran evenly now. Clara felt the difference immediately, the way a musician feels the difference when an instrument that's been slightly out of tune is finally corrected. Everything easier. Everything right? She used the corrected heat to make something she'd been planning since she first inventoried the pantry and found the tin of molasses at the back of the shelf. She'd been saving the idea for the right moment, and something told her this morning was it. She mixed the molasses into a bread dough that was richer than her usual biscuit recipe, darker, and she let it rest longer than strictly necessary because she had learned from her mother that the bread worth eating is the bread that's been given time to become what it wants to be. She shaped it into small rounds and put them in the oven while the eggs were cooking and the morning coffee was working its way through the pot. When the men sat down to breakfast, the smell hit them differently than usual. It was sweeter, warmer, more complicated than the clean savory of biscuits and beans. Several men looked up before they'd even served themselves, following the smell the way animals follow water. Bill Reese picked up one of the dark rolls and turned it in his hand, examining it with the seriousness he applied to most things. "What is this?" he said. "Molasses bread," Clara said. "Eat it warm." Bill bit into it and was quiet for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with reluctance. "Lord," he said softly. Roy Cutter, who had been maintaining a careful neutrality around Clara for the past 2 days, not hostile, not warm, just watchful and contained, reached across the table and took one of the rolls before anyone could pass them properly. He ate it in 3 bites. He reached for another one immediately. He did not say a word. He didn't have to. Gunnar took one roll, ate it with the steady focus he applied to everything, and then looked at Clara with an expression that was, by Gunnar's standards, approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. "You made this from what's in the pantry," he said. "Molasses tin from the back shelf," Clara said. It had been sitting there long enough that someone had clearly forgotten about it. Gunnar nodded. "Good find." "It usually is," Clara said, "when you look carefully at what's already there." She went back to the kitchen and she did not see the look that passed between Bill Reese and Gunnar over the bread basket, but it was the look of 2 men who have separately arrived at the same conclusion and are now confirming it with each other without needing words. She had been here 4 days. 4 days, and the table felt different. The men felt different. Not transformed, that kind of thing doesn't happen in 4 days, but shifted the way weight shifts when it finds a better resting point. Marcus Hale, who had taken his breakfast standing at the edge of the table, as was his habit when the morning's workload was heavy, stopped beside Clara on her way back to the kitchen. "Supply wagon from the mill comes tomorrow," he said. "Nathaniel got word this morning, faster than expected." Clara paused. "Good. I've been rationing the flour more than I'd like. Anything we need to clear in the storage room to make room for the order? I'll handle that this afternoon. I need to do a full inventory of the dry storage anyway. There are things in there I haven't gotten to yet." Marcus nodded. He started to move away, then stopped the way he was starting to do around Clara. That small hesitation, like a man who came equipped with one thought and keeps finding there's another one behind it. "The men are talking," he said. "What are they saying now?" "Good things." He said it plainly without decoration. "I want you to know that." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Marcus." He went. Clara filed that exchange away in the same internal place where she kept the things that mattered and said nothing about. The dry storage inventory took 2 hours and revealed exactly what Clara had half expected: a pantry that had been managed by people who either didn't know what they were doing or hadn't particularly cared whether they did it well. There were things stored in the wrong order, things that should have been cool, kept in warm spots, things that should have been used weeks ago, pushed to the back, behind items that could have waited. She reorganized it all with the methodical efficiency of long practice, making notes on a scrap of paper as she went. She was on the second shelf from the bottom, shifting a heavy sack of oats to the left to expose what was behind it when she found the ledger. It was a small flat book, the kind used for household accounting, tucked into the space between the oat sack and the wall, with the particular carefulness of something deliberately hidden rather than accidentally forgotten. She pulled it out and looked at the cover. No name, no date. She opened it. The handwriting was small and cramped and belonged to someone who was not comfortable being legible, the writing of someone who was keeping records for themselves rather than for anyone else. Clara looked at the columns. Numbers, dates going back 14 months, names of suppliers, and next to some of the supplier names in a second column, written in a slightly different ink, secondary numbers that were considerably smaller than the first. She understood what she was looking at. She closed the ledger. She sat on the floor of the storage room with it in her lap for a moment, thinking. Then she got up, tucked it into her apron pocket, and went to find Nathaniel Blackstone. He was at the corral talking to one of the older hands about the condition of a roan mare that had come up lame on the morning drive. He saw Clara coming across the yard and said something brief to the hand, who moved off toward the barn and turned to face her with the slight shift in attention that Clara had started to recognize, the way his whole body reoriented when she approached. Not dramatically, just with the particular focus of a man who has learned that when this woman comes to find him, she's found something worth finding. "Storage room," Clara said when she was close enough. She drew the ledger out of her apron and held it out to him. "Behind the oat sacks. Back wall." Nathaniel took it. He opened it. He looked at the columns for a long moment, and then he closed it the same way Clara had, carefully, deliberately, with the contained stillness of a man absorbing something that requires absorbing. "Webb's," he said. "The handwriting isn't his," Clara said. "I've seen Webb's signature on the supplier invoices in your office. This isn't the same hand." Nathaniel looked at her. "You think there was someone on the inside?" "I think Webb had help. Someone with access to the storage room who knew what was being ordered and what was actually being received and could keep track of the difference." She paused. "That's not a cook's job. That's a foreman's job." The silence that followed was the particular quality of a silence where something irreversible has just been said. Nathaniel looked at the ledger in his hand. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked toward the barn where Marcus Hale had, in the last 60 seconds, coincidentally found reason to be occupied at a considerable distance from the corral. "How long have you known?" Nathaniel asked. His voice was very controlled. "I didn't know," Clara said. "I suspected something was off with the ordering process the first morning when I looked at your ledger. The numbers didn't match what a foreman with 14 years of experience should have been getting for that budget. Either he wasn't paying attention, and Marcus Hale pays attention to everything, or he was paying attention to the wrong things." Nathaniel was quiet. "I could be wrong," Clara said, for the second time, because she was a woman who had learned the cost of certainty applied too quickly. "No," Nathaniel said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man who has just confirmed something he's been refusing to see. "You're not wrong." He looked at the barn for a long moment. "He's been with me for 14 years, Nathaniel said. "I know. He was with Elizabeth when she was sick. He was the one who he was here for all of it. His jaw was set very tight now, the muscle working. I trusted him with everything." "I know," Clara said again. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't minimize it. She understood from her own long experience of being betrayed by people who had decided she was easy to take advantage of, that comfort offered too quickly is just another way of asking the person in pain to be done with it faster than they're ready to be. "I need to handle this carefully," Nathaniel said after a long moment. Yes. I can't confront him without more than a hidden ledger. No, but you know who to ask about the supply delivery records going back 14 months, and you know how to read the numbers. Clara paused. You'll find it. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something open and a little raw, the look of a man who is holding something too heavy, and is aware for the first time that someone is standing close enough to help carry it. Why are you doing this? He asked. You've been here 4 days. Clara considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider all questions. Because this ranch was being robbed, she said, and the men who work here were eating badly because of it, and that bothers me. She paused. And because you gave me a chance when you didn't have to, and people who do that, she stopped. They deserve to know the truth about what's happening around them. Nathaniel held her gaze. Thank you, Clara, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Neither of them remarked on it. But she felt it the same way you feel the shift when a door opens into a different room, not a dramatic thing, just a thing that changes the geometry of where you are. Nathaniel moved on the information with the careful, unhurried precision of a man who understood that what he was about to do would permanently alter the architecture of his life and who intended to do it right. He sent 2 letters that afternoon, one to the county office for the supply records, one to a lawyer in Billings he'd worked with before. He told no one what he was doing, and his face when he came to supper that evening was the composed, undisturbed face he wore when he had made a decision and closed the door on it until it was time to act. Marcus Hale sat at the table that night, and Clara watched him the way she watched everything. Not overtly, not rudely, but with the peripheral attention of a woman who has spent her life reading rooms. He ate her food. He ate it well, the way he always did. He talked to the men on either side of him about the lame mare and the fence repairs and the weather coming down from the north. He was easy and unremarkable in every visible way. But once, just once, his eyes moved down the table to where Nathaniel was sitting. And in that single unguarded moment, something crossed his face that was not the expression of a man with a clear conscience. Clara looked away before he looked back. She went to the kitchen and washed the pots and thought about 14 years and about the kind of loyalty that turns and about the men who had been eating insufficient food for 2 years while someone at this table had been quietly ensuring that the money meant for their meals went somewhere else. She was angry. She was also smart enough to keep that anger internal and banked the way you bank a fire you need for the next morning hot and alive and not permitted to consume anything prematurely. The supply wagon from the mill arrived on Friday morning, and the arrival of it created a commotion on the ranch that Clara observed from the kitchen doorway with deep and genuine satisfaction. 3 men who had absolutely no reason to be near the storage yard materialized to watch the unloading. Roy Cutter, who was supposed to be mending tack on the far side of the barn, found himself inexplicably in the supply yard when the first sacks of flour came down off the wagon. Clara directed the unloading herself, standing at the storage room door and calling out where each thing went, because she had reorganized that storage room yesterday, and she wanted it loaded in the exact order she'd arranged it. The miller's man, a compact fellow with a sunburned neck and the evaluating eyes of someone who has dealt with a lot of ranch cooks, looked at Clara, directing the whole operation from the doorway, and said, "You the new cook?" "I am," Clara said. "Good order," he said, meaning the supply list. "Organized. Most ranch cooks order like they're guessing." "I don't guess," Clara said. He almost smiled. "We'll look forward to doing business with you." When the last sack was inside and the wagon had pulled out of the yard, Clara stood in the doorway of the fully stocked storage room for a moment and looked at it. Flour properly stored. Beans 2 varieties enough to last 2 months. Cornmeal. Sugar. Coffee. Real coffee, enough of it. Salt. Lard. Dried fruit. A quantity of spices that were going to change what this kitchen could produce so significantly that the men who currently thought her first week's cooking had been extraordinary were in for a considerable revision of what that word meant. Ethan appeared beside her. "That's a lot of food," he said. "That's what this kitchen should have had all along," Clara said. She looked at the shelves for another moment. Then she turned back to the kitchen. "Come on, I need help carrying the spice tins." Ethan followed her, and if he noticed that her voice had a different quality in it. Not harder, not softer, but fuller. The way a voice gets when a person is standing in the middle of something they've built and feeling the full weight of it. He didn't say so. He carried the tins. That evening, Clara made supper from the new supplies for the first time, and the difference landed on the table like a change in weather. The beans were the same beans she'd been making, but with cumin, now real cumin, not the ghost of it, and a bay leaf, and a correct amount of salt that she'd been rationing all week into something close to correct, but not quite. The cornbread had molasses and a handful of the dried fruit chopped fine and worked into the batter, which made it something between bread and dessert, in a way that had no name but needed none. The beef, the larger cut that had arrived with the supply order, a proper roast instead of the scraps she'd been working with, had been in the oven since 2 o'clock, slow-cooked with the onions and the new pepper and a quantity of garlic that she'd found at the bottom of one of the new crates and had greeted like an old friend. The smell reached the bunkhouse before the dinner bell. Men were at the table 5 minutes early. When the food hit their plates, the silence that fell over the table was not the silence of men who have nothing to say. It was the silence of men who have encountered something that requires their full attention and have the good sense to give it. Roy Cutter ate 3 full portions. He did not make a single remark from the beginning of the meal to the end. That from Roy Cutter was extraordinary. Bill Reese set down his fork at the end of his second helping and looked at the table in front of him for a moment with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. "I've been eating on ranches for 22 years, he said to no one in particular. "Chuck wagons line camps, bunkhouse kitchens, you name it." Nobody asked him to continue, but nobody stopped him either. "I never once," Bill said, "sat down to a meal on a working ranch that tasted like this." A short quiet followed that. Then Gunner said with characteristic economy, "Neither have I." Samuel, the 12-year man who'd complimented Clara on her first night, looked toward the kitchen doorway. Clara wasn't visible. She was inside already washing. But he looked anyway, the way people look toward the direction of the thing they mean to acknowledge. "Somebody ought to tell her," Samuel said. "Tell her yourself," Bill said. "She's right there." Samuel pushed back from the table, took his hat off, and walked to the kitchen doorway. Clara was at the washing tub, her back to the door, her sleeves rolled up. "Miss Whitmore," Samuel said. She turned. He stood there with his hat in both hands, a weathered man with 20 years of frontier on his face, and he looked at her with the direct, unadorned honesty of someone who has decided to say a thing and says it. "That's the finest meal I have ever eaten on a working ranch. And I have eaten on a great many." Clara looked at him. "Thank you, Samuel," she said. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked back to the table. At the table, Roy Cutter was staring at the cornbread in his hand as though it had personally done something to him. He set it down. He picked it up again. He looked at the kitchen doorway. He said nothing, but something in Roy Cutter's face had changed in a way that was visible to anyone paying attention, and Bill Reese, who was paying attention, saw it and said nothing, and ate his cornbread and decided to let the man arrive wherever he was going in his own time. It was Ethan who told Clara what happened next, and he told her the following morning while she was making the breakfast fire, his voice carrying the particular energy of someone who witnessed something and has been waiting all night to report it. "Roy went to Mr. Blackstone last night," Ethan said. Clara's hands stilled on the kindling. "Did he? After supper. I was coming around the side of the house and I heard them on the porch. Roy said—" Ethan paused, apparently trying to recall it accurately. "Roy said he owed somebody an apology and he wasn't sure how to give it. And Blackstone said, sometimes you just say the words and let them be what they are." Clara was quiet. What did Mr. Blackstone say to that? "He said Roy should say it to you directly and not use him as a middleman." Clara went back to the kindling. "Good advice," she said. "Roy said he didn't know how." Roy. Clara said, knows exactly how. He's just deciding if he's willing. Ethan thought about that. You think he will? I think, Clara said carefully, that Roy Cutter is a man who has spent a lot of his life being wrong about things and finding ways to not have to face that. And I think eating 3 portions of supper, made by the woman he publicly humiliated at the gate, is doing something to his internal accounting that he can't quite ignore anymore. She looked at Ethan. Go check the chickens. Ethan went. Clara built the fire up and thought about Roy Cutter and about the particular labor of changing a first impression you've committed to publicly, and she felt not warmth. Exactly, not forgiveness, because forgiveness was a thing she'd give when it was asked for, and not before, but something like recognition. She understood the architecture of that kind of pride, the way it kept a person from walking through a door they could see was open. She'd watched it her whole life. She'd felt it from the outside of it her whole life. She put the coffee on. She started on the biscuits. The confrontation with Marcus Hale happened on Saturday, and it happened faster than anyone expected, including Nathaniel. The records had come back from the county office by Friday afternoon, not the full accounting, but enough. Enough columns. Enough dates. Enough numbers that did not match what the ranch ledger said they should be. Nathaniel had spent Friday evening in his office with the door closed, and Clara, passing by on her way to the storage room, had seen the lamp burning under the door at an hour when the rest of the house was dark. She hadn't knocked. Saturday morning, just after breakfast, Nathaniel called Marcus into the office. Clara knew because Ethan told her afterward, because Ethan had been repairing the fence post nearest the office window and had not moved from that post for the entirety of what followed. What followed by Ethan's account was quiet at first, then not quiet, then quiet again, but a different kind. The silence, Ethan said, that comes after something breaks. Marcus came out of the office at 9:30. He walked across the yard to the bunkhouse. He came back out with his saddlebags. He did not look at anyone. He went to the barn and was in there for 20 minutes. When he came out, he was on his horse, and the horse was pointed toward the gate. Roy Cutter was the first one to see it. He was standing near the water trough, and he went very still when Marcus rode past, and the look on Roy's face was the look of a man watching something he had not anticipated and could not immediately process. Marcus did not stop. He did not say goodbye. He rode through the gate of Blackstone Ranch for the last time and turned south and did not look back. The yard was silent for a full 30 seconds after the sound of the hooves faded. Then Bill Reese said very quietly, "Well," and nobody had anything to add to that. Clara found Nathaniel on the porch an hour later. He was sitting in the chair that faced the yard, the one he used when he was thinking through something that required looking at a fixed point for a sustained period. He had his coffee cup in his hand, but it had clearly been cold for a while. He looked like a man who had just done something that needed to be done and was now sitting with the full weight of having done it. Clara came up the porch steps and sat in the chair beside him without being invited, because she had learned in the last 5 days that Nathaniel Blackstone was a man who did not always ask for company when he needed it. They sat for a moment. 14 years, Nathaniel said. Yes. He was at my wedding. He paused. He carried her casket. Clara said nothing. She understood that some grief doesn't have a response. It just needs to exist in the presence of another person. The money he took. Nathaniel said, "I don't even care about the money. I can recover the money." He looked at his cold coffee. It's what he knew about me, about Elizabeth, about what this ranch means. He stopped. Using the fact that I trusted him because of all of that. That's the real theft, Clara said. The money is just the visible part of it. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression that had something surprised in it, as though she'd said something he hadn't expected someone to say. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. They sat a while longer. The yard below them was moving with its usual Saturday workmen crossing the distant sound of the smith finishing up with the water pump, the chickens doing what chickens do, life continuing the way life does. I'll need a new foreman, Nathaniel said. Yes, you will. I don't know who I trust for it right now. That's honest, Clara said. Give it time. He looked at her sideways. You have an opinion. I always have an opinion, Clara said. And she thought about Ethan Cole camped at the fence post nearest the office window all morning. She thought about Samuel, who had been on this ranch for 12 years, and in all that time had never apparently asked for anything or taken anything that wasn't his. She thought about Bill Reese, who saw everything and said only what was true. Not yet, she said. Ask me in a month. Nathaniel almost smiled. You plan to still be here in a month. I plan, Clara said, to still be here when this place is running the way it should. How long that takes is up to the ranch. Nathaniel turned to look at her fully, then the full weight of that careful attention. You walked through that gate 6 days ago, he said. 5, Clara corrected. It was late Thursday the week before last. 5 days, Nathaniel said. In 5 days, you found the supply fraud, found the inside man, restocked the pantry, fixed the kitchen stove, and managed to make 50 cattle hands. Believe there might be a reason to stay. The stove repair was the smith, Clara said. Clara. She stopped. He was looking at her with something in his face that she didn't know quite what to do with, something open and serious, and not at all the careful managed expression he usually showed the world. Thank you, he said. Not for any one thing, for all of it, for seeing it, for saying it, for not pretending you didn't see it, which would have been easier. Clara held his gaze. Easier isn't something I've had much practice with, she said. No, Nathaniel said, and something in his voice wrapped around that word with a kind of recognition that was its own entire conversation. I don't think it is. They sat together on the porch for another few minutes, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. Below, Roy Cutter crossed the yard and looked up at the porch, and for a moment his eyes landed on Clara, and he stopped walking. He didn't say anything, but he took off his hat. He held it at his side and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was complicated and real, and not the face of a man who thought she needed to leave by sunrise. Then he put his hat back on and went on about his work. Clara watched him go. She picked up Nathaniel's cold coffee cup and stood up from her chair. I'll make a fresh pot, she said. She went back into the house, and behind her, she heard Nathaniel exhale, slow, long, the breath of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has for just a moment been allowed to set it down. She put the kettle on. Outside, the ranch went on. The fresh pot of coffee was ready by the time Nathaniel came back inside, and Clara set a cup on the corner of his desk without being asked and went back to the kitchen without waiting for acknowledgement. That was the rhythm they'd settled into without discussing it. A working rhythm, practical and unspoken, the kind that develops between two people who are both too busy and too honest for ceremony. What she did not expect was that the rhythm was about to be interrupted from the outside. The rider came through the gate at 10:30 on Saturday morning, and Clara heard him before she saw him. The hard, purposeful beat of a horse being pushed at a pace that said the rider had somewhere to be and was already late getting there. She was at the kitchen window when he came around the side of the main house, and she saw immediately that he was not one of the ranch hands. He was too well dressed for that, too deliberate in his bearing, the kind of man who understood that how you arrived somewhere was part of what you were saying when you got there. He asked for Nathaniel. One of the hands pointed to the porch, and the man dismounted and went up the steps, and Nathaniel came to the door, and the two of them went inside, and the door closed. Clara went back to the bread dough. She had learned in the past 5 days the particular discipline of minding what was hers to mind. She was a cook. She was a woman who had been given a room and a job and a supply account, and what happened in the main house between the owner of this ranch and his visitors was not her concern unless someone made it so. Except that Ethan Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway 11 minutes later with the look of someone trying to appear casual and failing entirely. Miss Whitmore. Ethan, there's a man with Mr. Blackstone. I saw him ride in. He's from... I heard his name. Pemberton. Arthur Pemberton. Clara worked the dough. Should that mean something to me? Ethan came the rest of the way into the kitchen and lowered his voice in the way people lower their voices when they're not certain they should be saying what they're about to say. Pemberton owns the 2 ranches to the north and west of here, the Anvil Range and the Diamond Creek operation. Between them, he controls about 40,000 acres. He paused. And there's been talk, it's been going around for months, that he wants Blackstone land. Clara's hands slowed. What kind of talk? The kind where a man keeps buying up the land around a property until the man in the middle doesn't have much choice about what happens next. Clara looked at Ethan. How long has this been going on? Since before I came on, Ethan said. Bill Reese knows more. He's been here 6 years. Go find Bill, Clara said, quietly, and don't make it obvious that you're doing it on my account. Ethan went. Clara shaped the bread and put it in the oven and thought about what she'd just heard and the particular shape of it. The supply fraud running 2 years, the foreman on the inside, and now a land buyer at the door. The same week the foreman was gone, arranged itself in her mind into a pattern that she did not like at all. Bill Reese came to the kitchen at noon under the entirely plausible pretext of asking whether there was any coffee left from the morning. There was. Clara poured it. She handed it to him and leaned against the counter with her arms crossed and waited. Bill drank half the cup. He was a man who took his time, and Clara had learned not to rush him. Then he said, Ethan says you asked about Pemberton. He showed up this morning. I know it. Bill drank the rest. Pemberton's been circling this ranch for 2 years, maybe longer. He made Blackstone an offer 14 months ago. Nathaniel turned it down flat. Then he made another one 8 months ago, a bigger number, and Nathaniel turned that one down too. He set the cup on the counter. After that, things started going wrong here. Supply problems, kitchen trouble. 2 good hands left for no clear reason and went to work for Pemberton's Anvil operation. He paused. I'm not saying those things are connected. But you're not saying they're not, Clara said. Bill looked at her steadily. I've been on working ranches my whole life, Miss Whitmore. Things go bad for ranches all the time for all kinds of reasons. Hard seasons, bad luck, poor management. He paused. But when things go bad in a very specific way at a very specific time, right after a man says no to someone who doesn't hear no, often that's a particular kind of pattern. Did Marcus know Pemberton? Clara asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. They were seen together in town, Bill said carefully. Twice that I know of. Could have been coincidence. Could have been, Clara agreed. They looked at each other. Nathaniel needs to know what you just told me, Clara said. Nathaniel already suspects it, Bill said. He's a smart man. He just doesn't have proof of the connection. He might have more than he thinks, Clara said, thinking of the hidden ledger still with Nathaniel, currently presumably in his desk drawer, under a great deal of new information. The ledger I found, if Webb and Marcus were both connected to Pemberton, the payment records might show it. Bill Reese set his empty cup on the counter and straightened up in the way of a man who has said what he came to say and is done. You be careful, he said, quietly, but with the weight of someone who means it specifically. I'm always careful, Clara said. I know it. I'm saying it anyway. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the counter edge. Pemberton isn't a man who's used to being inconvenienced, and right now, whatever conversation he's having with Nathaniel in that office, the thing that changed between his last visit and this one is you. Clara went still. He doesn't know that, she said. He will, Bill said. Word travels in this county. Word about what's been happening in this kitchen, about the supply orders, about Webb, about Marcus. That kind of word travels fast. He looked at her with the straight, unvarnished honesty that was his most consistent quality. You untangled 2 years of careful work in 5 days. If Pemberton set that up, he knows it's been untangled, and he'll want to know how. He went. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the weight of that settling in her chest, like a stone settling in deep water. Not panic, not fear, but the clear-eyed recognition of a woman who has walked into harder situations than she knew, and come out the other side, and who understands that coming out the other side requires keeping your eyes completely open. She went back to the bread. Pemberton left an hour later. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway. He was a large man, not heavy, but tall and broad in the commanding way of someone who had always occupied a lot of space and had never been asked to take up less. He rode a very good horse. He rode it the way men ride horses when they want you to notice the horse. His face as he crossed the yard to the gate was smooth and composed in the specific way of a man who is practiced at not showing what he's thinking. But his posture, just slightly too controlled, too careful, told a different story to anyone reading it correctly. He was not pleased. Clara watched him go through the gate, and she thought, good. Then she went to find Nathaniel. He was still in the office, standing at the window, not sitting standing, which meant he was in the stage of thinking that required movement to be possible. He turned when she came in, and she saw immediately from his face that the conversation with Pemberton had been neither pleasant nor simple. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand," Clara said. "I've been sitting with bread dough all morning." Something crossed his face that in a lighter moment might have been amusement. "He made another offer," Nathaniel said. "The third. Considerably larger than the second." "What did you say?" "I said no." He paused. "He said my operational difficulties of the past 2 years suggested I might want to reconsider my long-term position." Clara was very still. "He said that directly. He said it in the smooth way that men like Pemberton say things directly while preserving the ability to claim they didn't." Nathaniel moved from the window to the desk. He opened the drawer and took out the hidden ledger and set it on the desktop. "I've been looking at this more carefully. The secondary column, the smaller numbers next to the supplier names." He looked at her. "Those aren't kickbacks to Webb. The amounts are too regular, too consistent. They look like payments." "Payments to whom?" "That's what I need to establish." He paused. "There's a lawyer in Billings I sent for him yesterday. He should be here by the middle of next week. And there's a man I know in the county sheriff's office who I trust." He said it with a particular weight on the word trust, which had acquired new dimensions for Nathaniel Blackstone in the last several days. "I'm going to send for him today." "Good," Clara said. "In the meantime," Nathaniel said, and here his voice changed, became something more careful, more specific. The voice of a man delivering information he's been thinking about how to deliver. "Pemberton knows the situation here has changed. He'll know about Webb. He'll know about Marcus. He doesn't know about the ledger yet, but he'll be paying attention to this ranch in a way he wasn't before." He looked at her directly. "I want you to be aware of that." "Bill Reese already told me to be careful," Clara said. "Bill's a smart man." "He is," she paused. "Nathaniel, what does Pemberton want with this land specifically? He has 40,000 acres. What does one more ranch give him?" Nathaniel sat down at the desk. "Water," he said simply. "The creek that runs through the south quarter of this property feeds 3 of the most productive grazing sections in this part of the territory. It's why my grandfather chose this land. It's why my father built here. Whoever controls that water controls the grazing for 30 miles in 2 directions." He paused. "Pemberton controls the land on either side. If he gets this ranch, he controls the water. Every other operation in this valley becomes dependent on his goodwill for their cattle." Clara sat down. "That's not a purchase," she said. "That's a takeover." "Yes. And if I hold every independent rancher in this valley stays independent. If I sell within 5 years, Pemberton owns the water and effectively owns the valley." The scale of it settled on Clara slowly, not just this ranch, not just 50 men and a kitchen and a supply account. The whole valley. The men who were her neighbors, the families who had built here the whole fragile web of independent lives that depended on the particular stubbornness of one man who kept saying no. "Then you're not going to sell?" she said. "No," Nathaniel said. "I am not." "Good," Clara said. "What do you need from me?" He looked at her. "Keep this ranch fed and running well. What you're doing, what you've been doing this whole week, it matters more than you know. A ranch that's falling apart from the inside is a ranch that's easy to pressure. A ranch that's solid, that has men who want to stay, that's functional." He stopped. "It's harder to push around." Clara nodded. "I can do that," she said. The week that followed was the hardest and the steadiest at the same time. Clara cooked. She cooked with everything the full pantry now permitted, and the table changed day by day in the way a garden changes when it's finally given proper water, quietly at first, then, suddenly dramatically, in a way you couldn't miss. Monday's supper was a proper stew with the full range of the new spices and a pastry crust on top that the men hadn't seen coming and were not prepared for. Roy Cutter stared at it for a full 3 seconds before he put his spoon through the crust and the steam came up, and he ate in a silence so complete and so involuntary that the man beside him actually leaned over to check if he was all right. Roy said, "I'm fine," in a voice that sounded like a man who has just been informed of something he should have known sooner. Tuesday's breakfast broke a record that Clara didn't know existed until Bill Reese told her about it. Every single man on the property ate a second serving, which had not happened in the collective memory of anyone currently employed at Blackstone Ranch. Wednesday. 3 men who had been talking about leaving, who had been in quiet, low-voiced conversation with each other about prospects on other operations. Conversations that had been going on since before Clara arrived, and had continued out of pure, unresolved momentum. Stopped having those conversations. Not because anyone told them to, because they sat down to supper Wednesday evening and looked at what was in front of them and looked at each other, and the conversations simply stopped being necessary. Ethan told her about this on Thursday morning, reporting it with the earnest precision of someone who understands they're witnessing something and wants to get the details right. Samuel told them, Ethan said, not about leaving, about staying. He said there hadn't been a reason to stay that felt like a real reason in a long time, and now there is. Clara was making the Thursday biscuits and did not stop making them. "Samuel needs to be careful about giving me too much credit," she said. "People don't stay somewhere because the food is good. They stay because they feel like they belong somewhere. The food is just the part you can taste." Ethan thought about that. He paused. "That's really something, Miss Whitmore." "Go check the chickens, Ethan." He went, but he was smiling. Roy Cutter came to the kitchen on Thursday evening. Clara was not expecting him. She was finishing the last of the washing. The kitchen mostly cleaned, the lamp burning low, and she heard boots on the walkway and turned around expecting Ethan or possibly Nathaniel, because those were the two who came to the kitchen most reliably in the evenings. It was Roy. He stopped in the doorway and took off his hat and held it in both hands, the way a man holds a hat when he's doing something that costs him something. He was a big man, broad through the chest, weathered with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades looking at the horizon. He'd been loud and certain and unkind on the day Clara arrived. He had been none of those things specifically toward her since the night of the first supper, but he also hadn't bridged the distance. He'd just moved parallel to her, close enough that the absence of hostility was noticeable. Not close enough that it meant anything yet. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Roy," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looked at his hat, looked back up at her. "I said something to you when you came through the gate," he said. "About—" He stopped. "About how you looked. In front of everyone." Clara dried her hands on her apron and waited. "I've been eating your food for a week," Roy said. "Best food I've had since my mother's table, and she was a woman who could cook. And I've been watching you work. And I've been watching what this ranch has been since you got here against what it was." He stopped again. His jaw worked. "What I said to you at the gate was unkind, and it was wrong, and it wasn't true, and I knew it wasn't true when I said it. I just said it anyway. Because I was being a fool in front of an audience, and that seemed like the kind of thing a fool says." Clara looked at him. "I can't take it back," Roy said. "I know that, but I'm sorry for it. Directly to you, and meaning it." The silence after that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something completing a circuit, closing a door, finishing its swing. Clara said, "I accept your apology, Roy." He let out a breath. "I grew up being the person people said things about before they knew me," Clara continued. "My size, my clothes, where I came from. I learned early that the people who say those things aren't always the people they are at their worst. Sometimes they're just scared of being wrong and trying to get ahead of it." She paused. "You weren't right to say it, but I don't hold it as the whole of you." Roy Cutter looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was complicated and real. "You're a generous woman," he said. "More than I deserve." "Maybe," Clara said. "Come back tomorrow morning. I'm making something with the dried apple slices and the remaining molasses. You should be here for it." He almost smiled. The edge of it showed up something genuine and slightly surprised, and then he put his hat back on and said goodnight and went. Clara turned back to the kitchen and finished the last dish. She felt no triumph. She hadn't wanted Roy Cutter's defeat. She'd wanted his honesty, and she'd gotten it. And that was enough. The following morning brought the kind of trouble that arrives without announcing itself. Clara was pulling the apple pastry from the oven, the whole kitchen smelling like late autumn, and honeymen already finding reasons to be near the walkway 15 minutes before the breakfast bell when she heard the commotion from the yard. Not the ordinary kind. The specific sound of too many voices converging on one point. The sharpening of attention that happens in a group of men when something has gone wrong. She set the pastry on the counter and went to the kitchen door. 3 riders, coming through the gate without asking. Their horses were lathered, and their faces were set with the deliberate blankness of men who have been told what to do and are going to do it, and don't want to have a conversation about it. At the front of them was a man she didn't recognize. Heavy-set, middle-aged, with the kind of clothes that said administrator rather than rancher. He was carrying a folded document. Nathaniel came off the porch before the riders had fully stopped. "You're on private property," he said. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear. The voice he used when he had made a decision. The heavy-set man held up the folded document. "Mr. Blackstone, my name is Gerald Cook. I'm a land agent working on behalf of Pemberton Holdings. I have here a notice of a formal assessment." "I know what a formal assessment is," Nathaniel said, "and I know what it requires, which is prior notification of no less than 2 weeks. I haven't received prior notification." Cook shifted in his saddle. "The notification was sent to the county address on file. I receive my legal correspondence directly," Nathaniel said, "as is my right and as is specified in the county land records. Whatever you were told about where to send notification, whoever told you was misinformed." The pause that followed was controlled and precise. "Which means your assessment notice is not valid, and your presence on this property at this moment is trespass." The yard had gone completely quiet. 50 men, or close enough to 50, that it didn't matter, had arranged themselves at various points around the yard, in the way that men arrange themselves when something is happening, and they've decided to be present for it. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present. In the way that a body of water is present. You'd have to move through it to get anywhere. Roy Cutter was closest to the gate. He had not moved toward the riders or said anything. He was simply standing with his arms at his sides and his hat level, and the specific quality of his stillness communicated something that the 3 riders clearly understood, because the 2 behind Cook had shifted their horses slightly backward without seeming to intend to. Cook looked at the document in his hand. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the yard full of men who were not moving but were extremely present. "Mr. Blackstone," he said, and some of the administrative authority had left his voice. "This will not resolve the matter. Mr. Pemberton intends to pursue." "Mr. Pemberton," Nathaniel said, "can pursue whatever he chooses through the appropriate legal channels with the appropriate notifications, through my attorney in Billings, whose name and address I'll have sent to his office this afternoon." He paused. "You're welcome to a cup of water before you leave. It's a warm day." Cook folded the document. He looked at the yard one more time. He turned his horse. The three of them rode back through the gate. Roy Cutter watched them go, and when they were through the gate, he walked over and pushed it closed behind them. Not hard, not dramatically, just decisively. It made a solid sound in the morning air. Bill Reese exhaled somewhere to Clara's left. Gunner, standing near the barn door, crossed his arms and said nothing, which was his equivalent of a standing ovation. Ethan, beside Clara, in the kitchen doorway, said very quietly, "That was—" "Yes," Clara said. He didn't even raise his voice. "He didn't need to," Clara said. She went back inside, picked up the apple pastry, and carried it out to the breakfast table. Nathaniel came to the kitchen after breakfast. He sat on the visitor's stool and accepted the coffee Clara handed him without a word and drank half of it before he said anything. "The attorney arrives Tuesday," he said. "Good. The ledger may have what we need to establish the connection between Pemberton and Marcus and Webb. If it does," he paused, "it changes what Pemberton can do legally. And if it doesn't, then we fight it another way." He looked at his coffee. "I've been fighting for this ranch in one way or another since my father died. I know how to do it." He paused. "I just didn't know until very recently that I'd been fighting with someone opening the gate from the inside." Clara sat down across from him at the kitchen table the first time she'd sat at that table when there was someone else in the room, she realized. She'd always eaten alone, or standing, or on the step outside. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," Nathaniel said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of the usual qualifications and careful social management, made her pause. "Elizabeth," she said, "your wife. What was she like?" The question landed between them and settled there, and Nathaniel was quiet with it for a moment, not in the way of a man deciding whether to answer, but in the way of a man choosing where to begin. She was... He stopped. Thought. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and made it better without trying to. Not because she was charming, though she was, but because she paid attention. She paid attention to people in a way that made them feel... He paused again. Seen. Like what they said and did, and were actually registered with someone. Clara was quiet. "She would have liked you," Nathaniel said. "She would have liked you a great deal, actually." The directness of it was unexpected. Clara felt it land somewhere in her chest with a warmth that she hadn't anticipated. "I think I would have liked her too," she said. She had. She had no patience for the kind of nonsense that was performed at this gate when you arrived, Nathaniel said. The muscle in his jaw was tight for a moment. "She would have had something to say about that." "It sounds like she had something to say about most things." "She did." He almost smiled. She was almost never wrong, which was both remarkable and occasionally exhausting. Clara laughed, short, genuine, the kind that surprises you. Nathaniel looked at her when she laughed, and what was in his face in that moment was something she felt the full weight of and didn't look away from, and in the 3 or 4 seconds before she looked down at her coffee cup, something passed between them that had no name yet but was not nothing. She cleared her throat. "The attorney on Tuesday," she said. "Will he need access to the supply records I've been keeping my own since I started ordering the incoming delivery records? What was received? What matches the invoices?" Nathaniel blinked. "You've been keeping—" "Since the first delivery. It seemed sensible." She paused. "Given what I found in the storage room, it seemed very sensible." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "He'll need those. I'll have them organized by Monday." He shook his head slowly, not in negation, but in the way a person shakes their head when they're mildly overwhelmed by something and don't have another gesture available. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said mildly. "I haven't said anything yet. You're about to say something grateful, and I'm going to tell you it's unnecessary, so save us both the step." He looked at her. He said, "What if I want to say it anyway?" She met his eyes. The kitchen was warm, and the morning light was coming through the window, and outside the yard was moving with its ordinary sounds, and inside there was just the two of them, and the coffee, and the space between what was said and what wasn't. "Then say it," she said. Quietly. "This ranch was falling apart," Nathaniel said. "And I knew it, and I didn't know how to stop it. I thought the problem was the food, and the food was part of it, but it wasn't. It was everything, all of it, and I couldn't see far enough into it to find the root." He set his coffee cup down. "You walked through that gate 9 days ago with one cloth bag and an iron skillet, and you found the root in 5 days." Clara held his gaze. "You looked, Nathaniel," she said. "That's all. You looked, and you saw something worth taking a chance on. Everything else followed from that." He was quiet. "Not everyone would have," she said, "given what they saw at the gate." "Anyone who looked past what they saw at the gate," Nathaniel said, "would have done the same." "You'd be surprised," Clara said, "how few people do." The silence after that was the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. Nathaniel picked up his cup. He finished the coffee. He stood up and set the cup on the counter in the careful way he always did. Nothing thrown or left carelessly. Everything placed with the quiet consideration of a man who respects the space he moves through. "Supper tonight," he said. 7 o'clock, Clara confirmed. "I'll be there." He went to the door. He paused. "For what it's worth," he said without turning all the way around, "I think you've been seeing people clearly your whole life, and I think people have been failing to see you clearly for just as long." He went. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a moment after his boots faded on the walkway. She was not a woman who cried easily. She was not crying now. But something in her chest had shifted, something that had been held in a particular braced position for a very long time. The position of a person who has learned to expect a certain quality of treatment from the world, and has built their internal architecture around that expectation, and the shift was not dramatic or sudden, but it was real. She picked up his empty coffee cup. She washed it. She went back to work. Outside, Roy Cutter was helping Ethan repair the south fence post, and their voices carried across the yard in the ordinary music of men doing necessary work. And Gunnar was moving across the yard with a purpose, and Samuel was at the corral with the horses, and Bill Reese was somewhere with his coffee and his quiet watching. And Blackstone Ranch was going about the business of being a going concern on a Saturday in the Montana Territory. And in the kitchen, Clara Whitmore was going about the business of making sure that when these men sat down tonight, what they found on that table told them without words, because that was how she had always spoken the things that mattered, that they were valued, that their work was seen, that someone was paying attention. She was one woman with a cloth bag and an iron skillet. She had walked through a gate 9 days ago and been laughed at. And she was still here. The attorney from Billings arrived on Tuesday as promised, and his name was Harlan Finch, a lean, precise man in his late 50s who carried a leather case that looked like it had traveled a considerable portion of the American West and had the worn corners to prove it. He shook Nathaniel's hand, accepted coffee from Clara without fanfare, and sat down at the office desk with the ledger and the supply records and the county documentation and did not emerge for 4 hours. Clara fed him lunch at the desk. She did not ask questions. She went back to the kitchen and made the afternoon's bread and listened to the sound of the office door staying closed, and she understood that what was happening behind that door would determine the shape of everything that came after. Ethan appeared at 2 o'clock. "Finch hasn't come out," he said. "I know. That's a good sign or a bad sign?" "It's a sign that there's a lot to look at," Clara said, "which we already knew." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. He was quiet for a moment, and then said in the voice of someone who has been thinking about something and has decided to say it, "Miss Whitmore, if Pemberton wins this, if he gets the ranch somehow, what happens to you?" Clara looked at him. She had thought about this. Of course she had. She was a woman who had spent her whole life thinking about the practical geography of what happens next because there had never been anyone else to think about it for her. "I find another kitchen," she said simply. Ethan shook his head. "That's not—" He stopped. "You shouldn't have to." "No," Clara agreed. But should and do are different countries, and I've been living in the second one my whole life. She paused. Don't worry about me, Ethan. I've been walking into hard situations since before you were born. I know how to walk back out. He didn't look convinced. She didn't need him to be. Finch came out at 3:30. He found Nathaniel in the yard and Clara in the kitchen doorway, and he looked at both of them with the contained expression of a man who has reached a conclusion and is about to deliver it. The ledger, he said, is sufficient. Combined with the county supply records and Miss Whitmore's delivery documentation, we have a clear paper record of payments made through Webb's accounts to a secondary holding entity. He paused. That holding entity traces back through 2 intermediate accounts to a land management company operating under Pemberton's name. The yard was very quiet. Webb was being paid to overcharge and underdeliver, Finch continued. Hale was being paid to look the other way and to ensure the ranch remained. I'll use the word deliberately destabilized. The intent, as best I can reconstruct it from these records, was to bring Blackstone Ranch to a point of financial and operational distress severe enough that a fourth offer from Pemberton would be difficult to refuse. Nathaniel stood very still. Can you prove it? He said. In a court of law, yes. It will take time, these things always do, but yes. Finch looked at his case. Webb is the weak point. He kept better records than he should have, which is common among people who are afraid of being left to take the fall alone. If he's approached correctly, he'll cooperate. And Pemberton, Finch said carefully, is a man with significant resources and a very good attorney of his own. This will not be quick or clean. But the law is clear on what was done here, and the evidence is... He looked toward the kitchen doorway where Clara was standing. The evidence is remarkably organized. Nathaniel followed his gaze. Yes, Nathaniel said. It is. Finch looked between them with the mild, observant eye of a man who has spent 30 years watching people in difficult circumstances and has learned to read rooms very quickly. He said nothing further on the subject. He closed his case. I'll return to Billings tomorrow and begin the filing, he said. In the meantime, document everything. Every rider who comes through that gate, every communication from Pemberton's people, date and time. We will, Nathaniel said. Finch shook his hand. He turned toward the kitchen where Clara had gone back inside, and he paused at the doorway. Miss Whitmore, he said. She turned. That delivery ledger you kept, he said. The daily records from the first week. That may be the single most important document in this case. He paused. Most people don't think to keep that kind of record. Most people, Clara said, haven't spent 15 years managing kitchens where nobody was paying attention to what was coming in the back door. Finch looked at her for a moment. Quite, he said, and he went to get his horse. The first snow of the season came 3 weeks later. Not the storm, not yet. Just the first tentative snow, the kind that arrives overnight and covers everything in a thin, white quiet that burns off by mid-morning. Clara woke to it and stood at the kitchen window before the stove was lit and looked at the white yard and thought about the winter to come. She had spent the 3 weeks since Finch's visit preparing for it, with the methodical seriousness she applied to everything. The storage room was full, properly full, not just adequately stocked, but genuinely prepared with quantities calculated against the length of a Montana winter and the appetite of 50 working men. She had put up preserves from the late summer produce she'd sent Ethan for twice. She had organized the cold storage with the particular precision of someone who has lived through a supply shortage and understands viscerally what it costs. She had taught 3 of the younger hands Ethan included the basics of what she needed from them when the roads closed and the deliveries couldn't get through. This ranch, she had decided, was not going to be caught hungry, not while she had anything to do with it. The legal process against Pemberton was moving in the slow, grinding way that legal processes move, and Finch sent word every 10 days or so with updates that were simultaneously encouraging and maddening. Webb had agreed to cooperate, as Finch had predicted. The paper trail was being assembled. Pemberton had gone quiet. No more riders. No more visits. No more smooth men with folded documents arriving at inopportune hours. The quiet was not peace. Clara knew that, and so did Nathaniel. It was the quiet of someone recalculating. She was in the storage room doing inventory when Nathaniel found her on the morning of the first snow. He stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves and was quiet for a moment. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been doing my job," Clara said. "Clara." She turned. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he was looking at her with the full, unguarded attention that he'd been giving her more openly over the past weeks. No longer the careful, managed attention of the early days, but something that had stopped trying to be contained. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "All right, not here." He straightened. "Come up to the house tonight, after supper. There's something I want to say, and the storage room isn't the right place for it." Clara looked at him. "All right," she said again. He went. She stood among the shelves for a moment, her hand resting on a sack of flour, her pulse doing something she did not entirely approve of, but could not particularly argue with. She went back to counting. Supper that evening was the best meal she'd made since arriving. She hadn't planned it that way consciously, but the hands that had been cooking for 30 years made their own decisions sometimes. And what came out of that kitchen on the night of the first snow was something that made Roy Cutter set down his fork after the first bite and look at the ceiling for a moment, as though he was having a private conversation with God about the nature of gratitude. The beef was slow roasted with the last of the fall herbs. The potato dish had something new in it. Dried rosemary from the kitchen's own replenished supply crumbled into the fat before the potatoes went in, so the whole thing tasted like warmth and intention. The bread was the molasses variety because it was cold outside, and that bread felt like being inside. Bill Reese ate in his usual quiet way and said when he finished, "Miss Whitmore." Just her name. Just that. But the way he said it was a complete sentence. Gunnar looked at his empty plate and then at the kitchen and said, "Every night I think it cannot be better than the night before." Nobody answered him because nobody needed to. Clara cleared the dishes. The men drifted toward the bunkhouse with the particular contentment of people who have eaten well and are warm and have work to do tomorrow that they are not dreading. The yard went quiet in its evening way. She washed the last pot. She hung her apron. She went to the main house. Nathaniel was on the porch when she came around the side of the house, standing with a cup of coffee and looking out at the thin snow still visible on the ground in the pale evening light. He heard her step on the porch stairs and turned. He handed her the second cup that had been sitting on the porch railing. She took it. They stood together for a moment without speaking, which was something they'd gotten very comfortable with over the past weeks, the particular ease of shared silence between two people who have worked through enough difficulty together that they no longer need words to fill the space. "Finch sent word today," Nathaniel said. "I heard the rider. Webb testified formally yesterday. The connection to Pemberton is established in the record." He paused. "It won't be over quickly, but it will be over." "Good," Clara said. "This ranch is safe," Nathaniel said. "The water rights the land, all of it. It'll take the courts time to finish it, but the outcome is—" He stopped. "It's not in question anymore." Clara held her cup. The coffee was warm against the cold coming in off the mountains. "I'm glad," she said. And she meant it wholly without reservation, the way you mean something when you've put your own hands into the work of making it true. Nathaniel set his cup down on the porch rail. He turned to face her fully. "You've been here 5 weeks," he said. "I know. 5 weeks ago I opened that gate because I was desperate and you were standing there and you were the only person who'd asked for a chance in 3 months." He paused. "I want you to know that I know it wasn't just desperation. I saw something. I didn't know what it was yet, but I saw it." Clara looked at him. "And now," she said, "now I know exactly what it is," Nathaniel said. "And I know that this ranch is different because of you. The men are different, the kitchen is different, the accounts are different. He stopped. I'm different. Clara was quiet. The cold air moved between them, and she held her cup and waited. I don't want you to leave, Nathaniel said. Not because the ranch needs you here. Because I need you here. He paused, and in the pause was the weight of a man who has carried solitude for a long time, and is only now standing on a cold porch in the first snow of the season, allowing himself to say what that has cost him. Because this place has been quiet in the wrong way for 2 years, and you walked through that gate, and it stopped being quiet in the wrong way. And I don't know how to go back to the way it was. Clara set her own cup down. She looked at Nathaniel Blackstone, this tall, careful, stubborn, decent man, who had given her a chance when he didn't have to, who had said her name like it meant something from the first time he used it, who had sat on her porch step drinking cold coffee and trusting her with the things that cost him to say. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Nathaniel let out a slow breath. I'd like to... He stopped, collected himself in the careful way he did. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I'm not a man who moves quickly on things that matter to him. So I'm not going to say more tonight than what I've said. He met her eyes. But I want you to know the direction I'm moving in. Clara held his gaze. I know the direction you're moving in, she said. I've known it for a week. He went very still. And, he said. She picked up her cup from the railing. And, she said, I think you should take whatever time you need. She paused. But I'm not going anywhere. The look that crossed Nathaniel Blackstone's face in that moment was not a dramatic thing. It was not the large, expressive emotion of a younger or less contained man. It was something quieter than that and more complete. The look of a man who has been standing in a cold place for a long time and has just stepped into warmth and is allowing himself finally to feel it. He reached out and put his hand over hers, where it held the cup. Just for a moment. Then he took it away and picked up his own cup, and they stood together on the cold porch and looked out at the thin white covering the yard, and the mountains beginning to show their winter faces above the tree line. The first real storm came 2 weeks later. It arrived the way Montana storms arrive, without apology and without warning, the sky going from gray to white in the span of a few hours, and the temperature dropping so fast you could feel it happening in your bones. By nightfall, the roads were closed. By midnight, 6 inches of snow and more coming. Clara had known it was coming before the clouds did. She'd felt it in the week before in the angle of the light, in the smell of the air off the mountains, in the way the horses were uneasy, and the cattle were bunching. She'd been cooking toward it for days. When the storm hit, the storage room was full. The kitchen stove was burning at steady capacity. The men came in from their last outdoor work, frozen and wet and exhausted, and what was waiting for them on that table was a supper that Ethan later described in a letter to his mother in Indiana as the best meal of his entire life. Every man came back for a second plate, every single one. Roy Cutter, who had not returned for a second plate of anything in the first week of Clara's tenure, out of sheer stubborn principle, stood up from the table with his bowl, walked to the pot, filled it again, sat back down, looked at no one in particular, and said, I reckon a man can change his habits if the reason's good enough. Bill Reese said, took you long enough. Roy said, I'm a slow learner. And the table laughed, all of them, the real laugh of men who are warm and fed and safe in a storm. And it was the kind of laugh that makes a bunkhouse sound like the inside of a home. Clara heard it from the kitchen. She was washing the first round of dishes, the lamp burning bright, the stove making its good heat behind her, the storm howling past the eaves, and meaning nothing inside these walls. She heard 50 men laugh like they were home. She set down the pot she was washing. She stood still for a moment, and she felt in the deepest and most honest part of herself that she had not made a wrong turn 3 weeks ago, when she walked 3 weeks across open prairie to stand at the gate of a ranch where nobody knew her name. She had made the only turn there was. Nathaniel came in from the storm late that night after the men were settled and the animals were secure, and the work that needed doing in a storm had been done. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he always did now, and Clara was at the table with her supply ledger and a cup of tea, making notes for the week ahead. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Everyone's all right," she said. "Everyone's all right," he said. "You fed them well." "I fed them what they needed." He came in and sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and he looked at the ledger open between them, and at the cup of tea, and at the lamp burning, and at her face in the lamplight, and the expression on his face was the one she was learning to read, the one that said more than he was saying and always had. "You know what the hands are saying," he said. "They're saying a great many things. They always are. They're saying," Nathaniel said, "that Blackstone Ranch feels different than it did, that it feels like a place where they intend to stay." Clara closed the ledger. "Is that right?" she said. "Samuel told me tonight when we were coming in from the barn. He said he's been on 6 ranches in 20 years, and he's never once thought about whether he'd stay past a season. He's thinking about it now." Nathaniel paused. "He said it's because of you." "Samuel's a good man," Clara said. "Good men don't need much to want to stay somewhere. They just need to know that what they're doing means something." "And does it?" Nathaniel said. "Mean something. Here." She looked at him across the table. "Every meal means something," she said. "Every man who sits down and eats and feels like someone thought about what he needed, that means something. That's what a kitchen is. It's not the food. It's the fact that someone decided you were worth feeding well." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You've been deciding that your whole life," he said, "for other people." "Yes." "When does someone decide it for you?" The question landed in the kitchen between them and stayed there, and Clara felt it in the place where questions land when they're the right ones, not in her mind, but lower in the chest, in the long-held complicated territory of a woman who has given most of what she had and learned not to expect the same in return. She looked at Nathaniel. He was looking back at her with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who was not asking a rhetorical question. "I reckon," Clara said slowly, "that the right person in the right place could change a habit like that." "I reckon they could," Nathaniel said. And the storm blew past the eaves of the kitchen, and the lamp burned steady. And outside, 50 men were warm and fed and planning to stay. By spring, the legal proceedings against Pemberton had moved to a point where his attorneys were making settlement overtures, the particular kind that come from men who have seen enough of the evidence to know the direction of the wind. By spring, Ethan Cole had been named acting foreman by Nathaniel, with the particular ceremony of a young man who had not seen it coming and was briefly speechless before he straightened up and said, "Yes, sir. I won't let you down." Samuel had shaken his hand. Bill Reese had clapped him on the back. Roy Cutter had said, "Don't get full of yourself," which was Roy's version of congratulations, and everyone in the yard knew it. By spring, the men who had been thinking about leaving were not thinking about it anymore. By spring, Blackstone Ranch was a different thing than it had been in the fall, not in its land or its cattle or its buildings, but in the immeasurable quality of a place that has found its footing again, that knows what it is, that moves with the confidence of something that has survived the thing that was trying to break it. And at the center of all of it, in the kitchen, with the repaired stove and the fully stocked pantry and the supply ledger that was always current and always accurate, was Clara Whitmore. She was there at 4 in the morning when the fire needed building. She was there at 7 when the men came off the morning shift cold and needing coffee. She was there at noon and at supper and in the quiet hours in between, when the ranch breathed and settled and became itself. And in the evenings, sometimes, Nathaniel would come and sit at the kitchen table, and they would talk the way people talk when they have stopped performing for each other and are simply present about the ranch, about the law, about what had passed and what was coming, about his wife and Clara's mother, and the trail kitchen in Kansas, and the things that make a person who they are. On the first warm evening of April, he asked her something he had been working toward all winter. She said yes. She said it simply, without drama, the way she did most things, directly, without performance, with the full weight of a woman who had walked 3 weeks across open Montana prairie to stand at a gate and ask for a single chance. She had not known when she walked through that gate that she was walking toward this. But she knew now. The woman nobody wanted had become the woman nobody could replace. The woman they laughed at had become the reason 50 men sat down every evening with something that felt finally and completely like coming home. And on a warm April evening in 1887, at the kitchen table of Blackstone Ranch in the Montana Territory, Clara Whitmore, who had never needed more than a chance and who had made every chance count and who had fed every hungry person who sat at her table as though they were worth the best. She had looked at the man across from her and understood that some people walk into your life through a gate you almost didn't open and change everything about what's inside. She had been that person for this ranch. And this ranch and the man who owned it had been that for her. The woman who walked in with nothing stayed because she had everything that mattered, and that was never going to change.